Chapter 16 of Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy, by Ruth Putnam. Chapter 16. Guelders, 1473. The affairs of the little duchy of Guelders were among the matters urgently demanding the attention of the Duke of Burgundy at the close of his campaign in France. The circumstances of the long-standing quarrel between Duke Arnold and his unscrupulous son Adolphe were a scandal throughout Europe. In 1463, a seeming reconciliation of the parties had not only been effected, but celebrated in the town of Grave by a pleasant family festival, from whose gaieties the elder Duke, fatigued, retired at an early hour. Scarcely was he in bed, when he was roused rudely and carried off half-clad to a dungeon in the castle of Bourrin, by the order of his son, who superintended the abduction in person, and then became Duke Regnant. For over 6 years the old man languished in prison, actually taunted from time to time, it is said, by Duke Adolphe himself. Indignant remonstrances against this conduct were heard from various quarters, and were all alike unheeded by the young Duke, until Charles of Burgundy interfered and ordered him to bring his father to his presence, and to submit the dispute to his arbitration. Charles was too near and too powerful a neighbor to be disregarded, and his peremptory invitation was accepted. Pending the decision, the two dukes were forced to be guests in his court, under a strict surveillance, which amounted to an arrest. The first suggestion made by Charles was for a compromise between father and son. Let Duke Arnold retain the nominal sovereignty in Guelders, actual possession of one town, and a fair income, while to Adolphe be ceded the full power of administration. The latter was emphatic in his refusal to consider the proposition. Rather would I prefer to see my father thrown into a well, and to follow him thither, than to agree to such terms. He has been sovereign duke for 44 years. It is my turn now to reign. Arnold thought it would be a simple feat to fight out the dispute. I saw them both several times in the Duke's apartment, and in the council chamber, when they pleaded each his own cause. I saw the old man offer a gage of battle to his son. The senior belonged to the disappearing age of chivalry. A trial of arms seemed to him an easy and knightly fashion of ending his differences with his importunate heir. No settlement was effected before the French expedition, but Charles was not disposed to let the matter slip from his control, and when he proceeded to Amiens, the two dukes, still under restraint, were obliged to follow in his train. At a leisure moment Charles intended to force them to accept his arbitration as final. Before that moment arrived, the more agile of the two plaintiffs, Adolphe, succeeded in eluding surveillance and escaping from the camp at Wiley. He made his way successfully to Namur, disguised as a Franciscan monk. Then, at the ferry, he gave a florin when a penny would have sufficed. The liberality, inconsistent with his assumed role, aroused suspicion, and led to the detection of his rank and identity. He was stayed in his flight and imprisoned in the castle of Namur to await a decision on his case by his self-constituted judge. This was not pronounced until the summer of 1473. By that time Charles was resolved on another course of action than that of adjusting a family dispute in the capacity of puissant, impartial, and friendly neighbor. Adolphe's behavior toward his father had been extraordinarily brutal and outrageous. public comment had been excited to a wide degree. It was not an affair to be dealt with lightly by Duke Charles. The young Duchess of Guelders was Catherine of Bourbon, sister to the late Duchess of Burgundy, and Adolphe himself was Chevalier of the Golden Fleece. In consideration of these links of family and knightly brotherhood, Charles desired that the case should be tried with all formality. On May 3rd, 1473, an assembly of the order was held at Valenciennes, and the knights were asked to pass upon the conduct of their delinquent fellow, who was permitted to present his own brief through an attorney, but was detained in his own person at Namur. The innocence or guilt of his prisoner was no longer the chief point of interest as far as the Duke of Burgundy was concerned. The latter had made an excellent bargain on his own behalf with the moribund Duke of Guelders, who had signed, December 1472, a document wherein he sold to Charles all his administrative rights in Guelders and Zutphen for 92,000 florins, in consideration of Arnold's enjoying a life interest in half of the revenue of his ancient duchy. That clause soon lost its significance. The old man's life ceased in March 1473, and by virtue of the contract Charles proposed to enter into full possession of his estates, setting aside not only Adolphe, whom he was ready to pronounce an outlawed criminal, quite beyond the pale of society, but that Adolphe's innocent 8-year-old heir, Charles, whose hereditary claims had also been ignored by his grandfather. Before the knights of the order as a final court were rehearsed all the circumstances of the old family quarrel and of the late commercial transaction. Their verdict was the one desired by their chief. It was proven to their entire satisfaction that Arnold's sale of the Duchy of Guelders and Zutphen was a legitimate proceeding, and that the deed executed by him was a perfect and valid instrument whereby Charles of Burgundy was duly empowered to enjoy all the revenues of and to exert authority in his new duchy at his pleasure. As to Duke Adolphe, he was condemned by this tribunal of his peers to life imprisonment, as punishment for his unfilial and unjustifiable cruelty toward Arnold, late Duke of Guelders. Adolphe's protests were stifled by his prison bars, but the people of Guelders were by no means disposed to accept unquestioned this deed of transfer, made when the two parties to the conveyance were in very unequal conditions of freedom. In order to convince them of the justice of his pretensions, Charles levied a force almost as efficient as his army of the preceding summer, and fell upon Guelders. A truce, a triple compact with France and England, had recently been renewed, so that for the moment his hands were free from complications, an event commented upon by Sir John Paston, as follows. April 16th, 1473, Canterbury. As for tidings, there was a truce taken at Brussels about the 16th day of March last, between the Duke of Burgoyne and the Friends King's ambassadors, and Master William Atcliffe for the king here, which is a peace be land and be water till the 1st day of April, now next coming between France and England, and also the Duke's lands. God hold it forever. The writer had recently been in Charles' court. Writing from Calais in February, he says, As for tidings, here there be but few, save that the Duke of Burgundy and my lady his wife fareth well. I was with them on Thursday last past at Gaunt. The Duke of Burgundy was not the only pretender to the vacated sovereignty of Guelders. The Duke of Juliers was also inclined to urge his cause, were Adolphe's family to be set aside. At the sight of Burgundian puissance, however, he was ready to be convinced, and accepted 24,000 florins for his acquiescence in the righteousness of the accession. Several of the cities manifested opposition to Charles, but yielded one after another. In Nimwegen, long hostile to Duke Arnold, there was a determined effort to support little Charles of Guelder, who, with his sister, was in that city. The child made a pretty show on his little pony, and there were many declarations of devotion to his cause, as he was put forward to excite sympathy. For 3 weeks the town held on in his name. The resistance to the Burgundian troops was sturdy. When the gates gave way before their attacks, the burghers defended the broken walls. 600 English archers were repulsed from an assault with such sudden energy that they left their banners sticking in the very breaches they thought they had won, fine prizes for the triumphant citizens. But the game was unequal, and the combatants, convinced that discretion was the better part of valor, at last accepted the Duke of Cleves as a mediator with their would-be sovereign. On July 19th, the long civic procession headed by the burgomasters, wearing neither hats nor shoes, marched to the Duke of Burgundy with a prayer for pardon on their lips. The leaders of the opposition to his accession were delivered over to the mercy of the victor. The garrison were accorded their lives, and a tax was imposed on the city to indemnify the Duke for his needless trouble, and Guelder was added de facto to the list of Burgundian ducal titles. In the various state papers presently issued by the new ruler, the mention of the circumstance of his accession to the sovereignty was simple and straightforward, as in a certain document appointing Olivier de la Marche to be treasurer. The patent bears the date of August 18th, and was one of the earliest issued by Charles in this new capacity. As by the date of the late Messire Arnold, in his life Duke of Guelderland, these counties and duchy have lapsed to me, and by the same token the offices of the land have escheated to our disposition, and among others the office of Master of the Moneys of those countships, using the rights, etc., escheated to me, and in consideration of the good and agreeable services already rendered and continually rendered by our knight, etc., Olivier de la Marche, having full confidence in his sense, loyalty, probity, and good diligence, for these causes and others we entrust the office of Master and Overseer of Moneys of the land of Guelder to him, with all the rights, duties, and privileges thereto pertaining. In testimony of this we have set our seal to these papers. Done in our city of Nimwegen, August 18th, 1473. Thus signed by Messire le Duc. On the back of this document was written, "Today, November 3rd, 1473, Messire Olivier de la Marche took the oath of office of Master and Overseer of the land and duchy of Guelder." The charge of the ducal children, Charles and Philippa, was entrusted to the Duke, who in his turn deputed Margaret of York to supervise their education. In a comparatively brief time agitation in behalf of the disinherited heir ceased, and imperial ratification alone was required to stamp the territory as a legal fraction of the Burgundian domains. Under the circumstances, the minor heirs were the Emperor's wards, and it was his express duty to look to their interests. But Frederick III showed no disposition to assert himself as their champion. On the contrary, the embassy that arrived from his court on August 14th was charged with felicitations to his dear friend Charles of Burgundy for his acquisition, and with assurances that the requisite investiture into his dignities should be given by his imperial hand at the Duke's pleasure. Communication between Frederick and Charles had been intermittently frequent during the past 3 years, and one subject of their letters was probably a reason why Charles had been willing to abandon a losing game in France to give another bias to his thoughts. He was lured on by the bait of certain prospects, varying in their definite form indeed, but full of promise that he might be enabled eventually to confer with Louis XI, from a better vantage ground than his position as first peer of France. The story of these hopes now becomes the story of Charles of Burgundy. When Sigismund of Austria completed his mortgage in 1469 at Saint-Omer and returned home, as already stated, he was fired with zeal to divert some of the dazzling Burgundian wealth into the empty imperial coffers. An alliance between Mary of Burgundy and the young Archduke Maximilian seemed to him the most advantageous matrimonial bargain possible for the emperor's heir. He urged it upon his cousin with all the eloquence he possessed, and was lavish in his offers to be mediator between him and his new friend Charles. Frederick was impressed by Sigismund's enthusiastic exposition of the advantages of the match, and little time elapsed before his ambassador brought formal proposals to Charles for the alliance. The Duke received the advances complacently, and returned propositions significant of his personal ambitions. As early as May 1470, his instructions to certain envoys sent to the intermediary Sigismund are plain. In unequivocal terms, his daughter's hand is made contingent on his own election as King of the Romans, that shadowy royalty which veiled the approach to the imperial throne. Item. And in regard to the said marriage, the ambassadors shall inform Monsignor of Austria that since his departure from Hesdin, certain people have talked to Monsignor about this marriage and mentioned that, in return, the Emperor would be willing to grant to Monsignor the crown and the government of the kingdom of the Romans, with the stipulation that Monsignor, arrived at the empire by the good pleasure of the Emperor, or by his death, would in his turn procure the said crown of the Romans for his son-in-law. The result will be that the empire will be continued in the person of the Emperor's son and his descendants. Item. They shall tell him about a meeting between the imperial and ducal ambassadors, at which meeting there was some talk of making a kingdom out of certain lands of Monsignor, and joining these to an imperial vicariate of all the lands and principalities lying along the Rhine. In the following paragraphs of this instruction, Charles directs his envoys to make it clear to Monsignor of Austria, Sigismund, that the Duke's interest in the plan does not spring from avarice or ambition. He is purely actuated by a yearning to employ his time and his strength for God's service and for the defense of the faith while still in his prime. Should the Emperor refuse to approve the Duke's nomination as King of the Romans, the ambassadors are instructed to say that they are not empowered to proceed with the marriage negotiations without first referring to their chief. They must ask leave to return with their report. If Sigismund should take it on himself to sound the Emperor again about his sentiments, the envoys might await the result of his investigations. He was to be assured that while Charles was resolved to hold back until he was fully satisfied on this point, if it were once ceded, he would interpose no further delay in the celebration of the nuptials. He must know, however, just what power and revenue the emperor would attach to the proposed title. He was not willing to accept it without emoluments. His present financial burdens were very heavy, etc. The concluding terms of the instructions had reference to the marriage settlements. A kingdom of his own was not the Duke's dream at this stage of Burgundo-Austrian negotiations. The title that Charles desired primarily was King of the Romans, one empty of substantial sovereign power, but rich with promise of the all-embracing imperial dignity. Significant is the intimation that after this preliminary title was conferred, its wearer would be glad to have Frederick step aside voluntarily. A resignation would be as efficient as death in making room for his appointed successor. Frederick III had indeed intimated occasionally that a life of meditation would suit his tastes better than the imperial throne, but he seems in no wise to have been tempted by the offer made by Charles to relieve him of his onerous duties, and then to pass on the office to his son. At any rate, the emperor rejected the opportunity to enjoy an irresponsible ease. His answer to the Duke was that he did not exercise sufficient influence over his electors to ensure their accepting his nominee as successor to the imperium. There was, however, one honor that lay wholly within his gift. If Charles desired higher rank, the emperor would be quite willing to erect his territories into a realm, and to create him monarch of his own agglomerated possessions, welded into a new unity. This proposition wounded Charles keenly. He assured Sigismund, January 15th, 1471, that his nomination as King of the Romans would never have occurred to him spontaneously. He had been assured that it was a darling project of the emperor, and he had simply been willing to please him, etc. As to a kingdom of his own, he refused the proposition with actual disdain. Then various suitors for the hand of Mary of Burgundy appeared on the scene successively. To Nicholas of Calabria, Duke of Lorraine, grandson of old King René of Anjou, she was formally betrothed. My cousin, since it is the pleasure of my very redoubtable signor and father, I promise you that, you being alive, I will take none other than you, and I promise to take you when God permits it. So wrote Mary with her own hand, on June 13th, 1472, at Mons. On December 3rd, she declared all such pledges revoked as though they never had been made, and Nicholas, too, formally renounced his pretensions to her hand. There were several moments when Charles of France had appeared to be very near acceptance as Mary's husband, and several other princes seemed eligible suitors. Doubtless her father found his daughter very valuable as a means of attracting friendship. Doubtless, too, as Comines says, he was not anxious to introduce any son-in-law into his family. His 40th year was only completed in 1473, and he was by no means ready to range himself as an ancestor. At successive times the negotiations between Charles and Frederick were ruptured only to be renewed on some slightly different basis. Threaded together, they made a story fraught with interest for Louis XI, and one that very probably he had an opportunity to hear. Up to August 1472, it is a safe inference that Philip de Comines was fully cognizant of the propositions and counter-propositions, the understandings and misunderstandings, the private letters of, as well as the interviews with, the accredited Austrian envoys that appeared at one Burgundian camp after another. Probably there was nothing more valuable in the store of learning carried by the astute historian from his first patron to his second than all this fund of confidential miscellany. It seems a fair surmise that Louis XI enjoyed immensely the delightful private view into his rival's dreams, the disappointments and rehabilitation of his shattered visions. The relation would have made him not only fully aware of the reasons why Charles was diverted from his hot pursuit of the Somme towns, but thoroughly informed as to the great obstacles lying in the path which the Duke hoped to travel. Naturally, the king was quite willing to rest assured that ruin was inevitable. If his rival were disposed to wreck himself rashly on German shoals, the king was equally disposed to be an acquiescent onlooker and to spare his own powder. On his part, Charles was wholly unconscious of the extent of his loss of prestige within the French realm in 1472. There had been other periods when the king had appeared triumphant over his aspiring nobles, only to be again checked by their alliance. In the radical change undergone by the feudatories after Guien's death and Brittany's reconciliation, there was, however, no opening left for the Duke of Burgundy's re-entry as a French political leader. It was this definite cessation of his importance that Charles failed to recognize. Confident that his star was rising in the east, he did not note the significance of its setting in the west. Thereupon the situation was, Charles believing that his plans were his own secret, versus Louis, fully advised of those plans and alert to all incidents of the past, present, and future, in a fashion impossible to the Duke in his absorbed contemplation of his own prospects, blocking the scope of his view. With the Emperor's congratulations at the Duke's accession to Guelders, and his offers to invest him with the title, were coupled intimations that it was an opportune moment to resume consideration of an alliance between the Archduke Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. The Duke accepted the new overtures, and Rudolf de Solz and Peter von Hagenbach proceeded to the Burgundian and Austrian courts, respectively, as confidential envoys to discuss the marriage. Charles was far more gracious to de Sully than he had been to the last imperial messenger, the Abbé de Casanova, who had restricted his proposals to Mary's fortunes and ignored her father's. The Duke had no intention of permitting any conference to proceed on that line. He was explicit as to his requisitions. De Sully was surprised by a gift of 10,000 florins, explained by the phrase, "because Monseigneur recognized the love and affection borne him by the said Count." That was a simple retainer. Other benefits, offices, and estates were conferred, to take effect on the day when Monseigneur was named King of the Romans. The instructions to Hagenbach were definite, covering the ground of those previously mentioned, issued in 1470. He was, however, especially enjoined to assure Frederick that the Duke did not require his abdication. He would be content to step into the shoes naturally vacated by his death. The final suggestion resulting from these parleyings was that an interview between the two principals would be far more satisfactory than any further interchange of messages. It was not only a propitious time for a conference, but it was necessary. The ceremony of investiture of the Duke into his latest acquired fief made it evidently imperative that he should visit the Emperor, and to preparations for that event Charles turned his attention, now absolutely confident that the outcome must be to his satisfaction. He had as little comprehension of the character of the man with whom he was to deal as he had of Louis XI. The choice of a place caused some difficulty, each prince preferring a locality near his own frontier. Metz was selected and abandoned on account of an epidemic. Finally, Treves was appointed for the important occasion, and Frederick sent official invitations to the princes of the empire to follow him thither in October. Before Charles arrived at the rendezvous, another event had occurred that had an important bearing on his fortunes. Nicholas, Duke of Lorraine, died July 27th, leaving no direct heir. He had been relinquished as a son-in-law, but the geographical position of his duchy made the question of its sovereignty all important to Charles of Burgundy. If it could be under his own control, how convenient for the passage of his troops from Luxembourg to the south. The taste for duchies, like many another, can grow by what it feeds upon. Prepared to set out for his journey to Treves, Charles hastened his movements and proceeded to Metz with an escort so large that it had a formidable aspect to the city fathers. Whether they feared that their free city was too tempting a base for attack on Lorraine or not, the magistrates yet found it expedient to keep the Burgundian thousands without their walls. The emperor, too, was on his way to Treves. Many of his suite were occupying quarters in Metz. Room might be found for Charles and his immediate retainers, indeed, but the troops must make themselves as comfortable as possible outside the gates. So said the burgomaster, and Charles was forced to yield, and he made a splendid entry into the town under the prescribed conditions. His own paraphernalia had been forwarded from Antwerp, so that there should be an abundance of plate, tapestry, etc., to grace his temporary quarters, and the forests of Luxembourg had been scoured to secure game for the banquets. It was all very fine, but Charles was not in a humor to be pleased. He was annoyed about his troops. Very probably he had intended leaving a portion at Metz ready to be available in Lorraine if occasion offered. He cut short his stay in the town and marched on with his imposing escort to Treves, whence he hoped to march out again a greater personage than any Duke of Burgundy had ever been. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy, by Ruth Putnam. Chapter 17. The Meeting at Treves, 1473. On Wednesday, September 28th, Emperor Frederick made his entry into the old Roman city on the dancing Moselle. 2 days later, the Duke of Burgundy arrived and was welcomed most pompously outside of Treves by his suzerain. After the first greetings, ensued an argument about the etiquette proper for the occasion, an argument similar to those which had absorbed the punctilious in the Burgundian court when the Dauphin made his famous visit to Duke Philip. For 30 minutes the emperor argued with his guest, before feudal scruples were overcome and the vassal was induced to ride by his chief's side into the city. The entry was a grand sight, and crowds thronged the streets, more curious about the duke than about the emperor. Charles was then in the very prime of his life. His personality commanded attention, but there were some among the onlookers who found it more striking than attractive. One bystander thought that the very splendor of his dress, wherein cloth of gold and pearls played a part, only brought into high relief the severity of his features. His great black eyes, his proud and determined air, failed to cast into oblivion a certain effect of insignificance, given by his square figure, broad shoulders, excessively stout limbs, and legs rather bowed from continuous riding. There is, however, another word portrait of the Duke, as he looked in the year 1473, whose trend is more sympathetic. His stature was small and nervous, his complexion pale, hair dark chestnut, eyes black and brilliant, his presence majestic but stern. He was high-spirited, magnanimous, courageous, intrepid, and impetuous. Capable of action, he lacked nothing but prudence to attain success. From the two descriptions emerges a fairly clear picture of an energetic man, somewhat undersized, and sometimes inclined to assert his dignity in a fashion that did not quite comport with his physical characteristics. The conviction that he was a very important personage, with greater importance awaiting him, and his total lack of a sense of humor, combined with his inability to feel the pulse of a situation, undoubtedly affected his bearing and made it more pompous. The emperor was not an heroic figure in appearance any more than he was in the record of his reign. distinguished for being the feeblest as well as the longest in the annals of the empire. He was indolent, timid, irresolute, and incapable. His features and manners were vulgar, his intellect sluggish. Peasant-like in his petty economies, he was shrewder at a bargain than in wielding his imperial scepter. At Treves, he was accompanied by his son, the Archduke Maximilian, a fairly intelligent youth of 18, very ready to be fascinated by his proposed father-in-law, who was a striking contrast to his own languid and irresolute father, in energy and strenuous love of action. As the two princes rode together into the city, Charles's accoutrements attracted all eyes. The polished steel of his armor shone like silver. Over it hung a short mantle actually embroidered with diamonds and other precious stones to the value of 200,000 gold crowns. His velvet hat, graciously held in his hand out of compliment to the emperor, was ornamented with a diamond whose price no man could tell. Before him walked a page carrying his helmet studded with gems, while his magnificent black steed was heavily weighted down with its rich caparisons. Frederick III, very simple in his ordinary dress, had exerted himself to appear well to his great vassal. His robe of cloth of gold was fine, though it may have looked something like a luxurious dressing gown, as it was made after the Turkish fashion and bordered with pearls. The emperor was lame in one foot, injured, so ran the tradition, by his habit of kicking, not his servants, but innocent doors that chanced to impede his way. The Archduke Maximilian, gay in crimson and silver, walked by the side of an Ottoman prince, prisoner of war, and converted to Christianity by the Pope himself. And then there was a host of nobles, great and small. Among them were Engelbert of Nassau, and the representatives of the House of Orange-Cologne, whose titles were destined to be united in one person within the next half-century. The magnificence remained unrivaled in the history of royal conferences. The very troopers wore habits of cloth of gold over their steel, while their embroidered saddle-cloths were fringed with silver bells. Surpassing all others were the heralds-at-arms of the various individual states which acknowledged Charles as their sovereign, seigneur, count, or duke, as the case might be. They preceded their liege lord, clad in their distinctive armorial coats, ablaze with color. Before them were the trumpeters in white and blue, their very instruments silvered, while first of all rode 100 golden-haired boys, an angel throng. It was so difficult to decide as to the requisite etiquette of escort that the emperor and duke agreed to separate on the fairly neutral ground of the marketplace. Each proceeded with his own suite to his lodgings, Frederick to the archbishop's palace, and Charles to the abbey of St. Maximin, which had conferred on him some years previously the honorary title of Protector. His army was quartered within and without the city. 2 days for repose, and then the first official interview took place, which is described as follows by an unknown correspondent, evidently in the ducal suite. Yesterday, which was Sunday, Monsignor waited upon the emperor and escorted him to his own lodging, which is in the abbey of St. Maximin. My said lord was clad in ducal array, except for his hat. The emperor wore a rich robe of cloth of gold of cramoisy, and his son was in a robe of green damask. As to their people, both suites were very brave, jewelry and cloth of gold being as common as satin or taffeta. Monsignor received the emperor in a little chamber decorated with hangings from Holland that many recognized. The emperor made the Bishop of Mayence his mouthpiece to describe the stress of Christianity and to urge Charles to lend his assistance. Having listened to this address, Monsignor requested the emperor to please come into a large place where more people could hear his answer. Accordingly, they entered a hall decorated with the tapestry of Alexander, while the very ceiling was covered with cloth of gold. There was a dais whereon stood a double row of seats. Benches and steps were spread over with tapestry wrought with my lord's arms. Thither came the emperor and mounted the dais with difficulty. Monsignor the chancellor, clad in velvet over velvet cramoisy, first pronounced a discourse in beautiful Latin as a response to what had been said by the Seigneur of Mayence. Then, showing how the affairs of my said lord were affected by the king, he began with an account of the king's reception by Monsignor, whom God absolve, in his own residence, and he continued down to the present day, dilating upon the great benefits, services, and honor by him, received in the domains of Burgundy, the extortions he had made since and desires to make. Never a word was forgotten, but all was well stated, especially the case of Monsieur de Guienne. Finally, Monseigneur declared that if his lands were in security, there was nothing he would like better than to give aid to Christianity. After this statement, which was marvelously honest, the emperor arose from the throne. Wine and spices were brought, and then Monseigneur escorted the emperor to his quarters with grand display of torches. This is the outline of what happened on October 4th, in the said year 73. And as to the future, next Thursday the emperor will dine where Monseigneur lodges, et al. Faire le Grand du Roi, and there will be novelties. In regard to the fashion of the said emperor and his estate, he is a very fine prince and attractive, very robust, very human and benign. I do not know with whom to compare his figure better than Monseigneur de Croix, as he was 8 or 10 years ago, except that his flesh is whiter than that of Seigneur de Croix. The emperor has 700 or 800 horse as an escort, but the major part of the nobles present come from this locality. In regard to Monseigneur's departure, there is no news, and they make great cheer. This is all for this time. The German scholars in the imperial party listened most attentively to the style of the Netherlander's speech, as well as to his subject matter. More abundant in vocabulary than elegant in Latinity was their comment, a fault they considered marking all French Latin. The audience found time to note the style, for the subject of the address did not interest them greatly. The least observant onlooker knew that the main purpose of this interview was not the plan of a Turkish campaign, though Frederick appointed a committee to discuss that, whose members, Burgundian and German, in equal numbers, were instructed to study the Eastern question while Emperor and Duke were absorbed in other matters. In their very first session, this committee decided that the chief obstacle to a Turkish expedition was the Franco-Burgundian quarrel. This point was also raised by Charles in his first conference with Frederick. No campaign was feasible until the European powers were ready to act in concert. Louis XI was aiding and abetting the heathen by being a disturbing element which rendered this desired unity impossible. So Frederick appointed a fresh commission to discuss European peace, and this insolvable problem was a convenient blind for other discussions. On October 5th, a Burgundian fête gave new occasion for a display of wealth. Vulgar ostentation, sneered the less opulent German nobles who tried to show that their pride was not wounded by the sharp contrasts between imperial habits and those of a mere duke. On their side, the Burgundians remarked that it was a pity to waste good things on boors so little accustomed to elegantly equipped apartments that they used silken bedspreads to polish up their boots. A running commentary of international criticism, fine feasts, ostensible negotiations about projects that probably no one expected would come to pass, and an undercurrent, persistent and mandatory, of demands emphatically made on one side, feebly accepted by the other, while the two principals were together, and petulantly disliked by the emperor as soon as he was alone again. Such was the course of the conference. Frederick III had one simple desire, to marry his son to the Burgundian heiress. Charles desired many things, some of which are clear and others obscure. The very fact that the emperor did not at once refuse his demands gave him confidence that all were obtainable. Very probably he hoped to overawe his feudal chief by a display of his resources, and by showing the high esteem in which he was held by all nations. There at Treves, embassies came to him from England, from various Italian and German states, and from Hungary. On October 15th, a treaty was signed that made the new Duke of Lorraine virtually a vassal to Charles, an important step towards Burgundian expansion. There was time and to spare for these many comings and goings during the 8 weeks of the sojourn at Treves, and the Duke was not idle. That his own business hung fire, he thought was due to the machinations of Louis XI. He had no desire to prolong his visit, for he was well aware of the risk involved in keeping his troops in Treves. At first the magnificence of his equipage had amused the quiet old town, but little by little, in spite of the Duke's strict discipline, the presence of idle soldiers became very onerous. Charles did not hesitate to hang on the nearest tree a man caught in an illicit act, but much lawlessness passed without his knowledge. Provisions became very dear. There was some danger of an epidemic due to the unsanitary conditions of the place, ill-fitted to harbor so many strangers. The precautions instituted by the Roman founders in regard to their water supply had long since fallen into disuse. Weary of delays, the Duke demanded a definite answer from the Emperor as to the proposed kingdom, the matrimonial alliance, and his own status. Frederick appeared about to acquiesce, and then substituted vague promises for present assent to the demands. But when Charles, indignant, broke off negotiations on October 31st and began to prepare for immediate departure, Frederick became anxious, renewed his overtures, and a new conference took place, in which he consented to fulfill the Duke's wishes, with the proviso the sanction of his election should be obtained. Charles promised to go against the Turk in person, and to place 1,000 men at Frederick's disposal, so soon as all points of issue between him and Louis XI were settled, and provided that his estates were erected into a kingdom, which should also comprise the bishoprics of Liege, Utrecht, Toul, Verdun, and the duchies of Lorraine, Savoy, and Cleves. This realm was to be a fief of the empire like Hungary, Bohemia, and Poland, and transmissible by heredity in the male and female line, a necessary recognition of a woman's right, approved by both parties, for Mary of Burgundy was to marry Maximilian. Electoral confirmation alone was wanting, and in regard to that, there was much voluminous correspondence and much shuffling of responsibility. The electors of Mayence and of Treves were the only ones present to speak for themselves, and they declared that the matter ought to be referred to a full conclave of the Electoral College. Let the candidate for royalty await the decision of the next Diet, appointed for November at Augsburg. Never loath to delay, the Emperor proposed this solution to Charles, who replied haughtily that if his request were not complied with, he would join Louis XI in a league hostile to the empire. This was on November the 6th. The Archbishop of Treves then suggested that if the question could not wait for a Diet, at least the electors should be summoned, especially the Elector of Brandenburg, whom he knew to be influential with the Emperor, and who was a leader in the anti-Burgundian and anti-Bohemian German party. This seemed fair, but the Emperor suddenly put on a show of authority and declared, with an injured air, that he was perfectly free to act on his own initiative without confirmation. In the interests of Christianity and of the Empire, he would appoint Charles of Burgundy chief of the crusade, and he would crown him king. The organized opposition to his plan came to the Duke's ears and made him very angry. Yet, at the same time, he had no desire to dispense with electoral consent. Possibly, he felt that the imperial staff alone was too feeble to conjure his kingdom into permanent existence. It was finally decided that Frederick III should display his power to the extent of investing Charles at once with the Duchy of Guelders, while the more important investiture should be postponed. Very imposing was the ceremony enacted in the marketplace. Frederick was exalted upon a high platform ascended by a flight of steps. Charles, clad in complete steel but bareheaded and unattended, rode slowly around the platform 3 times, which they say was the custom in such solemnities of investiture, adds an eyewitness, as though he considered the ceremony somewhat archaic. Then the candidate dismounted, received the mantle of the empire from an attendant, and slowly ascended the steps to the emperor's feet, while a new escutcheon, displaying the insignia of the freshly acquired fiefs, quartered on the Burgundian arms, was carried before him. Kneeling at the emperor's feet, the Duke laid 2 fingers on his sword hilt, and repeated the oath of fealty and service in low but distinct tones. Other rites followed, and then Charles was proclaimed Duke of Guelders. Thus one object of the conference was attained, and all the world thought it was only a question of time when the greater investiture would be celebrated. Charles's star was in the ascendant. There seemed no limit to the power he had acquired over his suzerain, who apparently graciously nodded assent to his requests, while the Duke, too, withdrawing from his alliance with the King of Hungary, appeared very conciliatory in all doubtful issues. At the same time, his confidence in Frederick was by no means perfect. The emperor is acting with perfect imperial authority and thinks that no one has a right to dispute it. Nevertheless, the Duke yearns for the sanction of the electors and is set upon obtaining it. The tone taken by Charles was that of humble ignorance. Little instructed as I am in Imperial German law, I am anxious to have your opinion on the legal ability of the Emperor to erect a kingdom. On November 8th, in the evening, the electors present in Treves declared that they were not exactly sure about the imperial authority, but they were sure that it was not their duty to discuss the legal attributes of imperial puissance. Under these circumstances, what remained to hinder the attainment of Charles' desire? The Emperor consented, and the only people who could have stayed his consent expressly stated that his was the final word, not theirs. It was easy for onlookers to conclude not only that the coronation was certain, but that it was done. Know that our Lord the Emperor has made the Duke of Burgundy a king of the lands hereafter mentioned, and has assured the royal title to him and his heirs, male and female, all the territories that he holds from the empire together with Guelderland, lately conquered, and the land of Lorraine, lately lapsed to the empire in Fife, besides the Duchy of Burgundy, that formerly was held from the crown of France, also the bishoprics of Liege, Utrecht, Dolin, and others belonging to the empire, besides a few seigniories, also imperial fiefs. All this, royalty and principalities, he received from a Roman emperor. So wrote Albert of Brandenburg on November 13th, trusting to the word of an envoy who had left matters in so advanced a state when he departed from Treves that he felt safe in concluding that achievement had been reached. Various letters from the citizens of Bern, too, were filled with rumors from Treves. Most extraordinary is one of November 29th, intended to go the rounds of the Swiss Confederacy, containing exact details of the coronation of Charles as it had taken place 5 days previously. The boundaries of the new kingdom were specified. Venice, in hot haste to please the monarch, had instantly shown exceptional honor to the Burgundian resident. How exact it all sounded, yet there was no truth in it. The vacillating emperor was affected by the attitude of his suite, and by their varying representations. There is no actual proof of French interference, but French agents had been seen in the city, and might have had private audiences with the emperor. Gradually, relations changed between Charles and Frederick. There was a cloud, not dissipated by a 3 days' fête given by the Duke, November 19th through the 22nd, evidently in farewell. Was Charles too exigent with his demands? Too chary of his daughter? Probably. On November 23rd, instead of a definitive treaty, a simple convention was signed, postponing the coronation until February. Emperor and regal candidate were to meet again in Vensicone, Cologne, or Basel. In the interval, Charles was to come to a satisfactory understanding with the electors and obtain their official endorsement for the imperial grant. November 25th was appointed, not for the regal investiture, but for Frederick's departure. On the evening of the 24th, he gave audience to his councillors and princes. The electors present were urged by the Burgundians to give their own conditional approval at least, and to consent to a reduction of the military obligations to be incurred by Charles. It was a crisis, however, where nobody wished to pledge anything definitely. There was an evident disposition to await some further issue before final action. The leave-taking between the bargain-makers was expected to be as pompous as had been the entry into Treves. It was far into the night of November 24th when the audience broke up. Little rest was there for the imperial suite, for when the tardy November sun arose above the eastern horizon, its rays met Frederick sailing down the Moselle. Not only had no imperial adieu been uttered, but no imperial debts had been settled. This was the news that was awaiting Charles when he awoke. Baffled he was, but not in his hope of being a king that day. No, only in his expectations of a stately pageant. In all haste he sent Peter von Hagenbach to ride more swiftly along the bank than the boat could sail, so as to overtake the traveler and urge him to wait for a few more words on divers topics. In one account, it is reported that Frederick, though annoyed at the interruption, still assented to Hagenbach's request. No sooner was the latter away, however, than he changed his mind and continued his course. Rumor was busy in regard to this strange exit of the emperor from the scene. The general belief among contemporaries was that it was on the eve of the intended coronation that Frederick turned his back on the scene. Take first the words of Thomas Basson, whose statement that he was in the very midst of the events can hardly be doubted. But alas, how easily and instantly human desires change, and how fragile are the alliances and friendships of men, especially of princes, which are not joined and confirmed by the glue of Christ. As the sacred psalm sings, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the sons of men in whom there is no safety." Suddenly, forsooth, when they were thought to be harmonious in charity, benevolence, and friendship, when they offered each other such splendid entertainment, when they feasted together in regal luxury, in all unity and friendship, when all things, as has been said, needed for the magnificence of such a great honor were made ready and prepared, so that on the third day should occur the celebration of that regal dignity, and the promotion of a new king and the erection of a new kingdom, or the restoration and renovation of an ancient one, now obsolete from antiquity, were expected by all with great attention, something occurred. I do not know what, hesitation or suspicion, fancied or justified, unexpectedly affected the emperor, and embarking on his ship in the very early morning, he sailed down the river Moselle to the Rhine. And thus was frustrated the hope of the Duke and of all the Burgundians who believed that he was to be elevated to a king. In a moment, this hope was extinguished like a candle. We were present there in the city of Treves, attached to the suite of neither prince, not serving or pretending to serve either of them. But we ascertained nothing either then or later, although we had made many inquiries about the cause of this sudden departure, and we are still ignorant of the truth. When the day broke after the emperor's departure, and the Duke was informed of the fact, he was also assured that the vessel in which the emperor sailed was opposite the monastery of St. Mary, blessed to the martyrs. So he sent messengers hastily to beg the emperor to stay for a very brief interview with the Duke, assuring him that the very least delay possible should occur if he did the favor. But no attention was paid to the signals from the shore, and the course was continued. The bishop wrote these words some time after the event. There are other accounts preserved, actual letters written within a few days or weeks of November 25th, wherein is evinced similar ignorance of what had actually passed. The following gives several suggestions of difficulties not mentioned elsewhere. A certain Balthazar Sesner, secretary, writes to Master Johannes Geldhaus and others in Frankfurt, from Cologne, on December 6th. He was attached to the imperial service, and possibly was one of the few attendants on Frederick in the hasty journey from Treves. After touching on Cologne affairs, he proceeds. I must inform your excellencies how the Duke of Burgundy came with all pomp for his coronation as king of the kingdom of Burgundy and Friesland, with 26 standards beside a magnificent scepter and crown. He also wished to take his duchy and territories in Savoy and Guelders, and others in fief from him, and not from the empire. This and other extraordinary demands his imperial grace did not wish to grant, and on that account he has broken off the interview and gone away. Everything was prepared for the coronation, the chair for the taking. It is said that he is to be crowned in Aix. It may be hoped not. You can understand me as well as your faithful servant. Dear Master Hans, I hope that you will not laugh at me. I can please my gracious lord and be worthy of praise, if you will only trust me. Despatched from Cologne on St. Nicholas Day itself. To the jurisconsult Master Johannes Geldhaus, distinguished advocate, master, preceptor of the city of Frankfurt. The two kingdoms are also mentioned by Snoy. 2 realms, namely Burgundy and Frisia, in the second, Holland, Zeeland, Guelders, Brabant, Limburg, Namur, Hainaut, and the dioceses of Liege, Cambrai, and Utrecht. In the first, Burgundy, Luxembourg, Artois, Flanders, and 3 bishoprics. The chronicler adds that this plan was discussed in secret conference. Again, the rumor that the final straw that broke the emperor's resolution was the Duke's desire to take Savoy and Guelders from his hand alone is suggestive. On the Duke's part, this wish might indicate an attempt to separate a portion of territory from the empire in a way to deceive his contemporaries into thinking that his kingdom was an imperial fief, while, in reality, it was an independent realm, as he or his successors could declare at a convenient moment. But this seems at variance with his attested desire for electoral support. It was a curious tangle and never fully unraveled. Yet, considering the emperor's personal characteristics, his last action does not seem inexplicable. As his visitor showed the intensity of his will, Frederick became restive. Phlegmatic, obstinate, yet conscious of his own weakness, personal conflicts with a nature equally obstinate and much more vigorous were exceedingly unpleasant. The collision made him writhe uneasily, and prefer to slip out of his embarrassment as quietly as he could. The proposed leave-taking was to be very magnificent, and the magnificence again was signified of Burgundian wealth. Whether the Duke would surely keep his pledge of sharing that wealth with the Archduke if the Emperor went so far that he could not draw back, was a consideration that undoubtedly may have affected Frederick. Had Mary of Burgundy accompanied her father, had the wedding of the daughter and the investiture of the new king been planned for the same day, had the promises been exchanged simultaneously, the leave-taking might have passed, indeed, as a third ceremonial in all stateliness. If Frederick doubted the surety of his bargain, it is not surprising. It was notorious how the Duke had played fast and loose with his daughter's hand, withdrawing it from the grasp of a suitor as the greater advantages of another alliance were presented to him, or as the mere disadvantage of any marriage at all became unpleasantly near. Vigorous man of 40 that he was, Charles had no personal desire to see a son-in-law, in propria persona, waiting for his shoes, a fact perfectly patent to the Emperor, as it was to the rest of the world. The task of making the imperial adieu was entrusted to the imperial chamberlain, Ulrich von Montfort, who duly presented his master's formal excuses to the Duke on the morning of November 25th. Important and urgent affairs had necessitated his presence elsewhere. The arrangement discussed between them was not broken, but simply postponed until a more convenient occasion rendered its execution possible, etc. The Strasbourg chronicles report that Charles was in a towering rage on receiving this communication. He clenched his fists, ground his teeth, and kicked the furniture about the room in which he had locked himself up. But by the time these words were penned, these authors were better informed than Charles about the ultimate result of the Emperor's intentions. The Duke may have been angry, but he certainly controlled himself sufficiently to give several audiences in the course of the day, to envoys from Lorraine among others, and was ready to take his own departure by evening, not doubting that the crown and scepter, carefully packed with the mountain of his valuable treasure, would assuredly fulfill their destiny in the near future. Treves was left to its pristine repose, and Charles was the last man to realize that in its silence were entombed forever his chances of wearing the prematurely prepared insignia. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Charles the Bold, Last Duke of Burgundy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriDocs.org. Recording by Dory Smith. Charles the Bold, Last Duke of Burgundy by Ruth Putnam. Chapter 18. Cologne, Lorraine, and Alsace, 1473 through 1474. Late as it was in November, the weather was still very mild, and as the Emperor and Duke traveled in opposite directions, neither the former as he went down to Cologne, nor the latter as he passed up the valley of the Moselle to that of the L, was hindered by autumn storms. The summer of 1473 had been marked by unprecedented heat and a prolonged drought. Forest fires raged unchecked on account of the dearth of water, and, for the same reason, the mills stood still. The grape crops, indeed, were prodigious, but the vintage was not profitable because the wine had a tendency to sour. Gentle rains in September prepared the ground for an untimely fertility. Trees blossomed, and, though some fruits withered prematurely, cherries actually ripened. Thus the Rhinelands presented a pleasant appearance as Charles rode to Lorraine. His first pause was at Thionville in Luxembourg, where he stayed about a fortnight and received ambassadors from Hungary, Poland, Venice, England, Denmark, Brittany, Ferrara, the Palatinate, and Cologne. The result of his conference with the last named was a declaration on the Duke's part which seriously affected his later career. The condition of Cologne must be touched on as an essential part of this narrative. The late Duke of Burgundy had attempted to pursue a line of policy in regard to the ecclesiastical elections in the Diocese of Cologne that had succeeded in Liège and in Utrecht. In 1463, he had tried to force the chapter to elect his candidate. They had refused to follow his leading, but their own choice, Robert, brother of the Elector Palatine, did not prove a congenial chief, and the new prelate turned to Philip for aid when he found his chapter disposed to restrict both his revenues and his temporal authority. Later, in 1467, as the audacity of his opponents increased, the archbishop appealed to his brother, the elector, and to Charles of Burgundy. The latter was busy in France, but he wrote a sententious letter to Cologne, exhorting both chapter and city to be obedient to their chosen spiritual and lay lord. This intervention was resented. The breach widened between Robert and his people, culminating in actual hostilities. The chapter took possession of the town of Neuss, accepted Hermann of Hesse as their protector, and sent an embassy to Rome to state their grievances. The elector aided his brother, and the belligerent parties grew in strength. The city of Cologne wavered for a space, undecided which cause to espouse, and finally chose the chapter's side, signing a 5 years' alliance with that body, which had officially renounced allegiance to Robert, pending the judgment of Pope and Emperor on the dissension. Such was the state of affairs when Charles entered into possession of Guelders and manifested a disposition to interest himself in Cologne. He informed the chapter that he was greatly displeased with their contumely. To Cologne he said, "Be neutral," but the burghers showed so little inclination to heed his neighborly advice that he tried harsher measures and permitted Cologne merchants to be molested in his domains. In 1473, all hostilities were suspended in the hopes of imperial intervention. While Charles was still in Guelders, Robert paid him a visit, held long conferences with him, and probably received promises of future aid, for he had an air of arrogance when he returned from the interview. During a sojourn of Duke and Emperor at Treves, a papal legate, the Bishop of Fossombrone, arrived from Rome with plenary powers to settle Cologne affairs, and his measures were endorsed by Charles in a letter from Treves. For a time, Frederick III seemed inclined to refrain from interference, then something influenced him in another direction. When he arrived at Cologne in November, he received a warm welcome and costly gifts, which he repaid by conferring a mass of privileges on his good city, cheap and easy benefits. But he did not prove an efficient arbitrator, simply postponing any decision from day to day, though he was begged to settle all difficulties before Charles should attempt to relieve him of the trouble. True, Charles was detained elsewhere, but he no longer felt the need of conciliating the emperor, and at Thionville, on December 11, 1473, he issued a manifesto declaring that his friend Robert was entirely in the right, his opponents in the wrong. As these latter defied papal legate and arbitrator duly authorized to settle the points of dispute, he, Charles of Burgundy, would constitute himself defender of the insulted archbishop. At the same time, he dispatched Etienne de la Vigne to check the encroachments of the insolent rebels. The declaration emboldened Robert to defy the emperor's summons to meet him and the papal legate. They both declared that they would take measures to bring him to obedience, but Frederick did not wish to tarry longer at Cologne. In January he took his departure, having directed Hermann of Hesse to protect that see against all aggression. Apparently, at that time, in spite of the manifesto, there was no formal treaty between Charles and Robert, but there are 2 drafts for such a treaty in existence, wherein the former pledged himself to force chapter, nobles, and city to submission, in consideration of the sum of 200,000 florins, while the archbishop gave permission to his ally to garrison all strongholds, including Cologne. Pending his autumn sojourn in the Upper Rhinelands, Charles had, therefore, plans regarding Cologne definitely in mind. Lorraine. This duchy was even more interesting to Charles than Cologne, and there were many matters in its regard which demanded his urgent attention in 1473. It, too, was a pleasant territory, and conveniently adjacent to Burgundian lands. A natural means of annexation had been considered by Charles in the proposed marriage between Nicholas, Duke of Lorraine, and Mary of Burgundy. When that project was abandoned to suit Charles's pleasure, he retained the friendship of his rejected son-in-law until the latter's death in the spring of 1473. So unexpected was this event that there was the usual suspicion of poisoning, and this crime, too, was charged to the account of Louis XI, apparently without foundation. Certainly that monarch reaped no immediate advantage from the death, for the family to whom the succession passed was more friendly to Burgundy than to France. The heir to the childless Nicholas was his Aunt Yolande of Anjou, daughter of old King René of Anjou, sister to the unfortunate Margaret, late Queen of England, and widow of the Duke of Vaudemont. The Council of Lorraine lost no time in acknowledging Yolande as their duchess. She hastened to Nancy, the capital, with her son René, aged 22, where they were received hospitably, and then Yolande formally abdicated in favor of the young man, who was duly accepted as Duke of Lorraine. Now there was a large party of Burgundian sympathizers in Nancy, and it was probably owing to their pressure that strong links were at once forged between Charles and the new sovereign of the duchy. The apprehension lest the former should protect the land as he had the heritage of his namesake, little Charles of Guelders, was expressed by the timorous, but their counsels were overweighted, and on October 15th, René accepted a treaty whose terms were very favorable to Burgundy. In exchange for being protector, an office that the emperor had already been asked to change into suzerainty, René cemented an alliance, offensive and defensive, with Charles, giving the latter full permission to march his forces across Lorraine. Further, he pledged himself to appoint as officials in all important places on the route men bound by oath to the Duke of Burgundy. Yes, more, these were discharged from fidelity to René in case he abandoned Burgundian interests. Yolande of Vaudemont endorsed these articles by adding her signature to that of her son. Charles feared, however, that the provisions might not be adhered to by the Lorrainers, so humiliating were the terms, and exacted in addition the signatures of the chief nobles. On November 18th, 74 of these gentlemen attested their approval of an act that practically delivered their land to a stranger, evidence that they doubted the ability of their hereditary chief and preferred Burgundy to France. There is a story that Charles tried other methods than diplomacy before he got the better of the young duke in this bargain, that he actually had him stolen away from the castle of Joinville, where he was staying with his mother. Louis promptly came forward and arrested a nephew of the emperor, a student in the University of Paris, and kept him as hostage until the release of René. Rumor, too, asserts that there was a Treaty of Joinville, wherein René asserted his friendship with Louis, which was intermitted by his relations with Charles, to be resumed later. That also seems to be improbable. The formal alliance with Louis did not come then, though the king took immediate care to build up a party in his behalf in Lorraine, and to keep himself informed of the progress of the new regime. From Thionville, Charles journeyed on to Nancy, where he was welcomed by his protégé outside the city walls, and the two rode in together as the duke and the emperor had entered Treves. Charles had been so long keeping up a show of obsequiousness which he did not feel that, undoubtedly, he enjoyed again being the first personage. He refused, however, to accept the young man's hospitality, and spent the 2 days of his sojourn in the house of a certain Mahourdi, where he felt more at ease in his conferences with Lorrainers willing to proceed further to the disadvantage of their new sovereign. The allies certainly became more exigent. In various towns on the Moselle, Epinal, Charmes, Dompierre, etc., the Lorraine soldiers were replaced by Burgundians. This immediate and arrogant use of the rights he had wrested from the Duke of Lorraine alienated many who had been warm for Burgundy. René himself admired Charles as Maximilian had done. The strong man exercised a fascination over both youths, but the Duke did not turn this admiration into real friendship, underestimating the character of his protégé. His measures, too, were taken without the slightest consideration for local feeling. Garrison after garrison was installed and commanded to obey his officers alone, while the soldiers were allowed to levy their own rations, equivalent to raids on a friendly country. As always, the agglomeration of mercenary companies was difficult to control. The Duke did not succeed in having those remote from his jurisdiction kept in due restraint. Complaints began to pour into his headquarters. Public sentiment shifted day by day. The Burgundian became the personification of a public foe. Before Charles proceeded on his way to Alsace, René had begun to lose his admiration, and it was not long before he impatiently awaited an opportunity to break with his too doughty protector. Alsace. During the 4 years that Charles had delayed in coming to look at the result of the bargain of 1469 in the Rhine Valley, his lieutenant, Peter von Hagenbach, had given the inhabitants reason to regret the easygoing absentee Austrian seigneurs. Much had been done, undoubtedly, in restraining the lawlessness of the robber barons. The roads were well policed and safety was assured to travelers. "I spy" was the motto blazoned on the livery of the forces led by Hagenbach up and down the land until he had unearthed lurking vagabonds. It was acknowledged that gold and silver could be carried openly from place to place, and that night journeys were as safe as day. Still, this advantageous change had not won popularity for the man who wrought it. Perhaps the people thought it less burdensome to make their own little bargains with highwaymen or petty nobles a law unto themselves, than to meet the rigorous requisitions of the Burgundian tax collector. It was the country that had profited most by the new administration. The small towns had long enjoyed great independence and had shown ability in managing their own affairs. They wanted no interference. Not liked by those whom he had really protected, Hagenbach was absolutely hated by the burghers who felt his iron hand, without acknowledging that its pressure had more good than evil in it. Then there were the neighbors to be considered. The Swiss had hated Sigismund and all Austrians, and had been prepared to prefer Burgundy as a power in the Rhinelands. But Hagenbach took no pains to win their friendship. His insolent fashion of referring to them as fellows or rascals, added to the acts of aggression, unchecked if not condoned by him, aroused bitter dislike in him in the confederated cantons and in their allies Bern, Mulhouse, etc. By 1473 there was a growing sentiment in Helvetia that they would be happier if Austria had her own again, while the uneasiness in the cities that stood alone had greatly increased. Within Hagenbach's immediate jurisdiction, the opposition to his measures took a definite form long before the Duke's arrival there. The various commissioners sent by Charles to inspect the quality of his bargain had all agreed in an urgent recommendation to the Duke to redeem at the earliest possible moment all the troublesome mortgages honeycombing his authority. Hagenbach, too, was fully convinced of the necessity for this measure, but he was not provided with sufficient money to accomplish it. In the spring of 1473, therefore, he resolved to lay a new tax on wine. This impost, called the bad penny, was bitterly resented for two reasons. The burden was oppressive to the vintners, and it was an illegal measure, as no sanction had been given by the local estates. 3 towns, Thann, Ensensheim, and Brissac, declared that they were determined to refuse payment. Hagenbach marched to force into the Engelberg, a stronghold dominating Thann, bombarded the town, and took it easily. 30 citizens were condemned to death as leaders in an iniquitous rebellion against the just orders of their lawful governor. Some of these, indeed, were pardoned, though their estates were confiscated, but 5 or 6 were publicly executed, and their bodies hung exposed to view on the marketplace as a hideous object lesson of the cost of resisting Burgundian orders. One execution sufficed to render Ensensheim submissive, but Brissac proved more obstinate. The magistrates there did not resort to force. They declared there was no need, for they were fully protected by the article of the Treaty of St. Omer, which forbade arbitrary imposition of any tax on the part of the suzerain. Their determined refusal made Lieutenant consent to refer the question to the Duke of Burgundy, and messengers were dispatched to Treves to represent the respective grievances of governor and governed. The collection of the tax was postponed until Charles could examine the situation. A determined effort to bring the independent town of Mulhouse under Burgundian sway was another act of 1473, fanning opposition to a white heat that forged organized resistance to any extension of Burgundian authority. For 3 years Hagenbach had endeavored to convince the burghers of that imperial city that they would be wise to accept the Duke's protection and have their debts paid. The latter were, indeed, oppressive, but there was fear lest protection might be more so, and conference after conference failed to produce the acquiescence desired by Hagenbach. In 1473, that zealous servant of Burgundy declared that if the burghers persisted in their refusal, he would resort to force. Their reply was that Mulhouse could not take such an important step without consulting her friends, the Swiss. "Are the cantons going to help you pay your debts?" was the sneering comment of Hagenbach. "Mulhouse is a bad weed in a rose garden, a plant that must be extirpated. Its submission would make a charming pleasure ground out of the Sundgau, Alsace, and Breisgau." The Duke knew no city which he would prefer to Mulhouse for a sojourn, were his further statements. 2 days were given to the town council for an answer. Hagenbach remarked that it was useless to think that time could be gained until the mortgaged territories should return to Austria. Far from planning redemption, Duke Sigismund is now preparing to cede to Charles le Téméraire as much again of his domain and vassals. Still, Mulhouse was not convinced that the only course open to her was to let Charles pay her debts and receive her homage. No answer was forthcoming in the 2 days, but ready scribes had prepared many copies of Hagenbach's letter, which were sent to all who might be interested in checking these proposals of Burgundy. On February 24, 1473, a Swiss diet met at Lausanne, and there the matter was weighed. Hagenbach's letter was shown to those who had not seen it, and methods of rescuing Mulhouse from her dilemma were carefully considered. Years ago, a union had existed between the forest cantons and the Alsatian cities. There were propositions to renew this alliance so as to present a strong front to the Burgundian neighbor. The cantons had enough to do with their own affairs, but the result of the discussion was that, on March 14th, a 10-year Alsatian confederation was formed in an imitation of the Swiss. The chief members were Basel, Colmar, Mulhouse, Schlestadt, and 2 dioceses, and it is referred to as the Base Union or the Lower Union, the purposes being to guarantee mutually the rights of the contracting parties to meet for discussion on various questions, and, specifically, to help Mulhouse pay her debts. A few days later, March 19th, there was a fresh proposition to make an alliance between this Base Union and the Swiss Confederation. This required a referendum. Each Swiss delegate received a copy of the articles to take back to his constituents for their consideration. No bond between the Confederation and the Union was, however, in existence at the time when Charles was approaching Alsace. Various conciliatory measures on his part had somewhat lessened the immediate opposition to him, but, nevertheless, there were frequent conferences about affairs. Diets were almost continuous, and there were strenuous efforts to raise money to free Mulhouse from her hampering financial embarrassments. Hagenbach had not followed up his threats of immediate war measures, but it was known that he had obtained imperial authorization to assume the jurisdiction of Mulhouse, a step which her allies hoped to forestall by settling her debts. Strasbourg offered to contribute 600 florins, Bern and Solier 700, Basel 400, while Colmar, Schlestadt, Obernai, and Kaisersberg together hoped to raise another 400. A diet was called at Basel for December 11th, and Zurich and Lucerne were expected to enter into the union. The tidings of the Duke's approach were undoubtedly a stimulus to these renewed efforts to make the League strong enough to withstand him. The sentiment expressed by the pious Nebel, "May God protect us from his mighty hand," voiced probably a widespread dread. When Charles entered Alsace, his escort was large enough to inspire fear, but there was no opposition to his advance, though consultations, now at one city, now at another, were frequent. The Duke paid little heed to their deliberations, underestimating their importance, while he was gracious to any words of welcome offered to him. Strasbourg sent him greetings, while he rested at Châtenois, and so did Colmar. The latter town expressed her willingness to receive him and an escort of 100 or 200, but was firm in her refusal to admit a larger force within her walls. By this precaution, Charles was baffled in his plot to gain possession of the town, and so passed on his way. On Christmas Eve, the traveler made a formal entry into Brissac, where a temporary court was established, and where audience was given to various embassies with the customary Burgundian pomp. Meanwhile, the troops, forced to camp without the walls, were a burden to the land, and seemed to have been more odious than usual to their unwilling hosts. The citizens of Brissac offered homage on their knees and had their hopes raised high by their suzerain's pleasant greeting, but they failed to obtain the hoped-for assurance that the Treaty of St. Omer should be observed in all respects. Among the envoys were many who undertook to remonstrate in a friendly fashion about the imposition of the bad penny tax on the Alsatians and the over-severity of Hagenbach's administration. The cause of Mulhouse, too, was urged, notably by Bern. The representations of these last envoys were received most courteously. The Duke rather thought that the city could be detached from the League, and therefore gave himself some trouble to establish friendly relations. To Mulhouse, too, his tone was conciliatory. He wrote a pleasant letter to the town, and dispatched a counsellor thither, who would, he assured them, arrange matters to their satisfaction. But an abortive coup d'etat on the part of the Burgundians, which would have given them possession of Basel, destroyed the effect of these reassuring phrases. The burghers were warned in time, looked to their defences, and banished from their midst every individual suspected of Burgundian sympathies. Every newcomer was carefully scrutinized before he was admitted within the walls, and the Rhine was guarded most rigidly. The propriety of these precautions was soon proven. Charles ordered a review at Ensensheim, the official capital of the Landgraviate. Thither marched his troops from every quarter. Those from Sackingen, Laufen, and Waldshut found their shortest route over the bridge at Basel, and there they appeared and begged to be allowed to cross. Their sincerity was doubted, and the least foothold on the city's territory was sternly refused then and a week later when the request was renewed. The method of introducing friendly troops into a town and then seizing it by a sudden coup de main was what Charles had been suspected of plotting for Metz, and later for Colmar, and there seems to be no doubt that a third essay of this rather stupid stratagem was planned, only to fail again, and this time to be peculiarly disastrous in its reflex action. The review took place, and the strength of the Burgundian mercenaries was duly displayed to the Alsatians, but no satisfactory assurances were given to Brissac and the other towns that their suzerain would restrict his measures of taxation and administration to the stipulations of the contract of Saint-Omer. On the contrary, when Charles passed on to Burgundy, it was plain to all that he had not restricted the powers of his lieutenant in any respect, but rather had endorsed his general method of procedure. One night was spent at Thann, and then the Duke took his leave of the annexed region whose people had hoped so much from his visit to them. In mid-January he arrived at Besançon, his winter journeying being wonderfully easy in the unprecedentedly mild weather. Hagenbach lost no time in proceeding to the levying of the impost now approved by the Duke, who had at the same time expressly ordered that the people were to be treated mildly, and that summary punishment was to check all excesses on the part of the 800 Picards employed by Hagenbach to aid the tax collector. The governor, however, saw no further need for gentle treatment or for respect to privileges. In Brissac, municipal elections were arbitrarily set aside, and officers appointed by the governor. The corporation was curtailed of power, and the burghers were forced to prepare to march against Mulhouse. Having accomplished his duty to his own satisfaction, Hagenbach proceeded to give himself some relaxation. His own marriage took place on January 24th, and he celebrated the occasion with great fêtes. It is of this period in Hagenbach's life that the stories of gross excess are told. It seems as though, having once abandoned restraint towards the city, his personal passions too were permitted to run riot, and he spared no wife nor maid to whom he took a fancy. As he had succeeded in impressing the bad penny on the little independent landowners, he tried to extend it to the territory of the Bishop of Basel. Vehement was the opposition which was reported to the Duke, who promptly ordered his lieutenant to restore the prisoners he had taken and to cease his aggressions. Charles was not ready to meet the Swiss, and was willing to defer an issue, but he was wholly ignorant of the real strength of the Confederation. Hagenbach then proceeded to make a stronghold of Brissac, and waited for further action. End of chapter 18. Recording by Dory Smith.
Chapter 19 of Charles the Bold, the Last Duke of Burgundy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stacy Dugan-Wilcox. Charles the Bold, the Last Duke of Burgundy by Ruth Putnam. Chapter 19. The First Reverses, 1474 to 1475. Who is this that cometh, this that is glorious in his apparel, travelling in the greatness of his strength? These words in Latin, on scrolls fluttering from the hands of living angels, met the eyes of Charles of Burgundy at his retarded arrival in Dijon, and the confident Duke had no wish to disclaim the subtle flattery of the implied comparison between him and the subject of the words of the prophet. The traveller had slept at Paris-Nice, about a league from the capital of Burgundy, so as to make the last stage of his journey thither in leisurely state. Unpropitious weather on Saturday, January 22nd, the appointed day, made postponement of the ducal parade necessary, out of consideration for the precious hangings and costly ecclesiastical robes that were to grace the ceremonies of reception and investiture. Fortunately, Sunday, January 23rd, dawned fair, and heralds rode through the city streets at an early hour, proclaiming the Duke's gracious intention to make his entry on that day. Immediately, tapestries were spread, and everyone was alert with the last preparations. Lavish was the display of biblical phrases, like that cited, which were planted along the ducal way and on a succession of stagings erected for various exhibits. On the great city square, the platform was capacious, and many actors played out diverse roles. Here stood the scroll-bearing angels on either side of a living representation of Christ. In the background clustered 3 separate groups of people representing, respectively, the 3 estates. Above their heads more inscriptions were to be read. All the nations desired to see the face of Solomon. Behold him desired by all races. Master, look on us, thy people, were among the legends. The stately pageant, in which dignitaries, lay and ecclesiastical, from other parts of the Duke's domains participated, proceeded past all these soothing insinuations that Charles of Burgundy resembled Solomon in more ways than one, to the church of Saint-Benigne. Here pledges of mutual fidelity were exchanged between the Burgundians and their ruler. The Abbé of Citeaux placed the ducal ring solemnly upon Charles's finger as a symbol, and he was invested with all the prerogatives of his predecessors. From the church, the train wound its way to the Sainte-Chapelle, past more stages decorated with more flowers of scriptural phrase, such as, "A lion which is strongest among beasts and turneth not away for any. The lion hath roared, who will not fear? The righteous are as bold as a lion," etc. 2 days later, the concluding ceremonies of investiture were performed and followed by a banquet. Charles was arrayed in royal robes, and his hat was in truth a crown, gorgeous with gold, pearls, and precious stones. After a repast, prelates, nobles, and civic deputies were convened in a room adjoining the dining hall, where first they listened to a speech from the chancellor. When he had finished, the Duke himself delivered an harangue, wherein he expatiated on the splendors of the ancient kingdom of Burgundy. Wrongfully usurped by the French kings, it had been belittled into a duchy, a measure much to be regretted by the Burgundians. Then the speaker broke off abruptly with an ambiguous intimation that he had in reserve certain things that none might know but himself. What was the significance of these veiled allusions? It could not have been the simple scheme to erect a kingdom, because that was certainly known to many. Charles had, doubtless, an ostrich-like quality of mind which made him oblivious to the world's vision, but even he could hardly have ignored the prevalence of the rumors regarding the interview of Treves, rumors flying north, east, south, and west. Might not this suggestion of secrets yet untold have had reference to the ripening intentions of Edward IV and himself to divide France between them? When his own induction into his heritage was accomplished, Charles was ready to pay the last earthly tribute to his parents. A cortege had been coming slowly from Bruges, bearing the bodies of Philip and Isabella to their final resting place in the tomb at Dijon, to which they were at last consigned. A few weeks more Charles tarried in the city of his birth, and then went to Dole, where he was invested with the sovereignty of the Franche-Comté and confirmed the privileges. Thus, after 7 years of possession de facto, he first actually completed the formalities needful for the legal acquisition of his paternal heritage. The expansion of that heritage had been steady for over half a century. Every inch of territory that had come under the shadow of the family's administration had remained there, quickly losing its ephemeral character, so that temporary holdings were regarded in the same light as the estates actually inherited. At least Charles, sovereign duke, count, overlord, mortgagee, made no distinction in the natures of his tenures. But just as the last link was legally riveted in his own chain of lands, he was to learn that there were other points of view. The statement is made and repeated that the report of the Duke's after-dinner speech at Dijon was a fresh factor in alarming the people in Alsace and Switzerland about his intentions, and making them hasten to shake off every tie that connected them with Charles and his ambitious projects of territorial expansion. As a matter of fact, there had been for months constant agitation in the councils of the Swiss Confederation and the Lower Union as to the next action. Opposition to Sigismund had been long existent. Antipathy to Austria was so deeply rooted that the idea of restoring that suzerainty in the Rhine Valley was slow to gain adherents. Probably the arguments that came from France were what carried conviction. It was a time when Louis spared no expense to attain the end he desired, while he posed as a benevolent neutral. His servants worked underground. Their open work was very cautious. It was French envoys, however, who announced to the Swiss Diet, convened at Lucerne, that Sigismund was quite ready to come to an understanding in regard to an alliance and the redemption of his mortgaged lands. That was on January 21st, 1474, the very day when the mortgagee was preparing to ride into Dijon and read the agreeable assurances of his wisdom, strength, and puissance. Yet a month, and Sigismund's envoys were seated on the official benches at the Basel Diet, ranking with the delegates from the cantons and the emissaries from France. On March 27th, the Diet met at Constance, and for 3 days a debate went on, which resulted in the drafting of the Ewige Richtung, the Règlement Définitif, a document which contained a definite resolution that the mortgaged lands were to be completely withdrawn from Burgundy and all financial claims settled. This resolution was subscribed to by Sigismund and the Swiss cantons. Further, it was decided to ignore 1 or 2 of the stipulations made at Saint-Omer, and to offer payment to Charles at Basel instead of Besançon. Meantime, that creditor, perfectly convinced in his own mind that the legends of his birthplace were correct in their rating of his character and qualities, again crossed Lorraine and entered Luxembourg, where he celebrated Easter. It was shortly after that festival, on April 17th, that a letter from Sigismund was delivered to him, announcing in rather casual and offhand terms that he was now in a position to repay the loan of 1469, made on the security of those Rhinelands. Therefore, the Austrian would hand over at Basel 80,000 florins, 40,000 of the sum received by him, 10,000 paid in his behalf to the Swiss, and 30,000 which he understood that Charles had expended during his temporary incumbency, and he, Sigismund, would resume the sovereignty in Alsace. It was all very simple, at least Sigismund's wish was. The expressions employed in the paper were, however, so ambiguous, the language so involved, that Charles expended severe criticism on his cousin's style before he proceeded to answer his subject matter. To that, he replied that the bargain between him and Sigismund was none of his seeking. The latter had implored his protection from the Swiss, had begged relief in his financial straits. Touched by his petitions, Charles had acceded to his prayers, and the lands had enjoyed security under Burgundian protection as they never had under Austrian. Charles had duly acquitted himself of his obligations. He had done nothing to forfeit his title. The conditions of redemption offered by Sigismund were not those expressly stipulated. If a commission were sent to Besançon, the Duke would see to it that the merits of the case were properly examined. If, on the contrary, you shall adhere to the purpose you have declared, in violation of the terms of the contract and of your princely word, we shall make resistance, trusting with God's help that our ability in defense shall not prove inferior to what we have used to repulse the attacks of the Swiss, those attacks from which you sought and received our protection. Before this letter reached its destination, the Duke's deputy in the mortgaged lands had already found his resources wholly inadequate to maintain his master's authority. After Charles departed from Alsace, Hagenbach's increased insolence and abandonment of all the restraint that he had shown while awaiting the Duke's visit soon became unbearable. The deliberations in Switzerland concerning their return to Austrian domination also naturally affected the Alsatians and made them bolder in resenting Hagenbach's aggressions. Thann and Ensisheim were both firm in refusing admission to his garrisons. Brissac was in his hands already, and her fortifications held by mercenaries, but an order to the citizens to work, one and all, upon the defenses, produced a sudden disturbance with very serious results. It was at Eastertide, and the command to desecrate a hallowed festival, one especially cherished in the Rhinelands, proved the final provocation to rebellion. There is a black story in the Strasbourg Chronicle, moreover, that this misuse of Easter Day was not Hagenbach's real crime. He simply wished to get all combatants out of the city before butchering the inhabitants, and his purpose was discovered in time. That charge does not, however, seem substantiated by other evidence, but there is no doubt that the citizens lashed themselves into a state of fury, fell upon the mercenaries, and killed many of them in spite of their own unarmed condition. Hagenbach, driven back into his lodgings, appeared at the window and offered various concessions, being actually humbled and intimidated by the unexpected turning of the submissive folk against him. But the revolutionary spirit raged beyond the reach of conciliatory words. Some of the more intelligent burghers endeavored to give a show of propriety to events by promptly re-establishing their own ancient council, arbitrarily abolished by Hagenbach, while taking a new oath to the Duke of Burgundy, according to the formula of 1469. They also dispatched envoys to the Duke with explanations of their proceedings, stating further that it was Hagenbach's misrule alone to which protest was made, that they were not in revolt against Charles. The latter answered, "Send Hagenbach to me." But the provisional government, by the time they received this order, felt strong enough to disregard it, and to continue to act on their own initiative. Hagenbach was cast not only into prison, but into irons. All fear of and respect for his authority was thrown to the winds, his offer of 14,000 florins as ransom being sternly refused. Deputations came from the Confederation to congratulate the officials de facto and to promise aid. The next step gave the lie direct to the message sent to Charles, upholding his authority while protesting against his lieutenant. Sigismund was urged to return to his own without further delay for legal formalities with his creditor. He assented. On April 30th, accordingly, the Austrian Duke arrived in Brissac and picked up the reins of authority which he had joyfully dropped 4 years previously. The rabble welcomed his coming with effusion, singing a ready parody of an Easter hymn. Christ is arisen, the landvogt is in prison. Let us all rejoice. Sigismund is our choice. Kylie oleasan. Had he not been snared, evil had it fared. But now that he is ta'en, his craft is all in vain. Kylie oleasan. Thus it was under Sigismund's auspices that the late governor was brought to trial. Instruments of torture sent from Basel were employed to make Hagenbach confess his crimes, but there was nothing to confess. As a matter of fact, the charges against him were for well-known deeds, the character of which depended on the point of view. What the Alsacians declared were infringements of their rights, the Duke's deputy stoutly asserted were acts justified by the terms of the treaty. In regard to his private career, the prisoner persisted in his statement that he was no worse than other men, and that all his so-called victims had been willing and well rewarded for their submission to him. On May 9th, the preliminaries were declared over, and the trial began before a tribunal whose composition is not perfectly well known, but which certainly included delegates from the chief cities of the Landgraviate, and from Strasbourg, Basel, and Bern. The trial was practically Lynch law, in spite of the cloak of legality thrown over it. Charles alone was Hagenbach's principal, and he alone was responsible for his lieutenant's acts. The intrinsic incompetence of the court was hotly urged by Jean Irma of Basel, Hagenbach's self-appointed advocate, but his defense was rejected. Public opinion insisted upon extreme measures, and the sentence of capital punishment was promptly followed by execution. Petitions from the prisoner that he might die by the sword and be permitted to bequeath a portion of his property to the church of Saint-Étienne at Brissac were granted. The remainder of his wealth was confiscated by Sigismund, who had withdrawn to Fribourg during the progress of the trial. Even Hagenbach's bitterest foes acknowledged that the late governor made a dignified and Christian exit from the life he had not graced. Charles is said to have beaten well the messenger who brought him the news of this trial and execution, in the very presence of Sigismund, who had not yet bought back his rights in the Landgraviate, where he had appointed Oswald von Thierstein as governor, and where he was thus presuming to use sovereign power. This was not sufficient, however, to make the Duke change his own plans. Stephen von Hagenbach was entrusted with the commission of punishing the Alsacians for his brother's ignominious deposition, and he did his task grimly. According to the Strasbourg chronicler, this Hagenbach at the north and his colleague, the Count of Blamont at the south, did not have more than 6,000 or 8,000 men apiece, but they left Hun-like reputations behind them. Devastation, slaughter, pillage in houses and churches, all in the name of the Duke, contributed to the zeal with which the Austrians' return was ratified by popular acclamation, and with which the contingents sent to Alsace by the Confederates were received. Sigismund's letter to Charles is casual in tone and obscure in phraseology. A statement presented somewhat later to the Emperor by the Boss Union is more precise in the justification offered for the events and in the grievances rehearsed. That is, Sigismund treats the transaction as a purely financial one, naturally completed between him and his creditor by the offer to liquidate his debt. The plea made by the Alsacians and their friends is that Charles had failed to keep his solemn engagements, and that his appointed lieutenant had been peculiarly odious and had broken the laws of God and man, and that the mercenaries employed by him, the Burgundians, Lombardians, and their fellows, had pitilessly ravaged the county of Ferret, the Sundgau, and the diocese of Basel. The charges are itemized. All this, well known to the Duke of Burgundy, has neither been checked nor punished by him. In consequence, our gracious Seigneur of Austria has been obliged to restore the land and people to his sovereignty and that of the House of Austria, which he has done with God's aid to prevent the complete annihilation and total destruction of land and people. Charles did not hasten to Alsace to settle matters in person, but pursued his intention of reducing Cologne to the archbishop's control, undoubtedly thinking that the base, which would then be open to the archbishop's protector on the lower Rhine, would facilitate his operations in the upper valleys. Meanwhile, the Emperor Frederick had emphatically declared that he alone was the defender of the diocese, and that the unholy alliance between Robert and Charles was a menace to the empire. His letters to Charles exhorted him to abandon the enterprise and to accept mediation. Those to the electors, princes, and cities of the empire urged them to defend Cologne against Burgundy until he himself arrived on the scene. There was a hot correspondence between all parties concerned, from which nothing resulted. Charles had various reasons for delay. There was trouble in other quarters of his domain. Flanders was in a state of ferment at his requisitions for money, and the Franche-Comté was on the point of making active resistance to the imposition of the gabelle. In view of all these complications, Charles decided to prolong his truce with Louis XI to May 1st, 1475. That monarch was well pleased to continue to pursue his own plans under cover of neutrality. The determination of the anti-Burgundian coalition in Germany to keep Charles within the limits of his own estates was a pleasant sight to the French king, and he felt that he could afford to wait. In June, an edict was sent forth from Luxembourg, forbidding all owing allegiance to the Duke of Burgundy to have any commercial relations with the rebels of Cologne or of Alsace or with the cities of the Boss Union, and declaring the Duke's intention to take the field at once to reinstate the Archbishop in his rightful see. This was a declaration of war, and was speedily followed by the Duke's advance to Maestricht, where he spent a few days in July collecting a force which finally amounted to about 20,000 men. On the 29th he sat down before Neuss, which had again emphatically refused entry to him and his troops. 3 days the Duke gave himself for the reduction of the town, but there he remained encamped for nearly a whole year. Neuss was resolved to resist to the last extremity, while Bonn, Andernach, and Cologne contributed their assistance by worrying and harassing the besiegers to the best of their ability. It was a period when Charles seemed to have only one sure ally, and that was Edward of England, whose own plans were forming for a mighty enterprise, no less than a new invasion of France. On July 25th, the very day that Charles was on his march up to Neuss, his envoys signed at London a treaty wherein the Duke promised Edward 6,000 men to aid him to reconquer his realm of France. Nothing loath to dispose of his future chickens, Edward in his turn pledged himself to cede to Charles and his heirs, without any lien of vassalage, the Duchy of Bar, the Countships of Champagne, Nevers, Rethel, Eaux, and Guise, all the towns on the Somme, and all the estates of the Count of Saint-Pol. Other territories of Charles were to be exempt from homage. Yes, and by June 1st, 1475, Edward would land in France and set about his conquests, nor were commercial interests forgotten. To the Duchess his sister, to the Flemings, is accorded permission to take from England wool, woolen goods, brass, lead, and to carry thither foreign merchandise. The year when Charles was waiting before the gates of Neuss was full of many abortive diplomatic efforts on the part of both the Duke and Louis XI, and it was the latter who managed to save something even from broken bargains. The Swiss not only counted on his friendship, but were constantly encouraged by his money, which emboldened them to send a letter of open defiance to Charles. "We declare to your most serene highness and to all of your people, in behalf of ourselves and our friends, an honorable and open war." To the herald who delivered this document, Charles answered, "Oh, bairn, bairn!" He felt that he had been betrayed. This was on October 26th. The defiance was followed by a descent of the mountaineers upon Alsace, which Charles had not yet released from his grasp. Stephen von Hagenbach prepared to defend Burgundian interests at Héricourt, a good strategic position on the tiny Luzine. Here, the Swiss were about to besiege him when the Count of Blamont arrived with 2 bodies of Italian mercenaries, aggregating more than 12,000 men, and attempted to draw off the besieging force. His plan failed. The tables were turned. It was the Burgundians who were fiercely attacked and who lost the day. Hagenbach was forced to surrender, obtaining honorable terms, however, and Sigismund put a garrison into Héricourt on November 16th. This was a tremendous surprise to Charles. That cowherds could repulse his well-trained troops was a thought as bitter as it was unexpected. But he put aside all idea of punishing them for the moment, and continued to reduce Neuss to the obedience of the good archbishop, and Hermann of Hesse continued to aid the town in its determined resistance. The opprobrious names applied to the would-be and baffled conqueror at this time are curiously similar to the epithets hurled at Napoleon a few centuries later. He was compared to Antichrist himself, with demoniac attributes added, when Alexander was felt to be too mild a comparison. There was still a terrible fear of the Duke's ambition, even though, in the face of all Europe, the Swiss had repulsed his men, and Neuss obstinately refused to open her gates, while the world wondered at the Duke's obstinacy displayed in the wrong place. The belief expressed several times by Comines that God troubled Charles's understanding out of very pity for France was a current rumor. At the end of April, an English embassy arrived at the camp, which was kept in a marvelous state of luxury, even though disease was not successfully curbed in the ranks. The urgent entreaty of the embassy was that Charles should raise this useless siege, fruitless as it promised to be, owing to the difficulty of cutting off the town's supplies. Edward IV was almost ready to dispatch his invading army. He implored his dear brother to send him transports, and to prepare to receive him when he landed. A letter from Jean Paston gives a glimpse into the situation. "For tidings here there be but few, save that the assiege lasteth still by the Duke of Burgoyne afore Neuss, and the Emperor hath besieged also not far from there a castle, and another town in likewise wherein the Duke's men ben. And also the French king, men say, is comen right to the water off Somme with 4,000 spears, and some men have that he will, at the day of breaking off truce, or else before, set upon the Duke's countries here. When I hear more, I shall send you more tidings. The king's ambassadors, Sir Thomas Montgomery and the Master of the Rolls, be coming homewards from Neuss, and as for me, I think I should be sick but if I see it. For it is so that tomorrow I purpose to ride into Flanders to purvey me of horse and hernies, and percase I shall see the assiege at Neuss ere I come again." There was more reason for Charles to be heartsick at the sight than for Jean Paston, and he did grow weary of the further waiting, and anxious, for his truce with Louis was drawing to a close. On May 22nd, there was a skirmish between his troops and the imperial forces, wherein Charles claimed the victory. In reality, there was none on either side, but the semblance was sufficient to soothe his amour propre, and to convince him that an accommodation with Frederic would not detract from his dignity. A large fleet of Dutch flatboats had been dispatched to help convey the English army, thirsting for conquest, across the sea. 6,000 men in the Duke's pay, too, were ready to meet Edward IV and swell his escort as he marched to Rheims for his coronation. Other matters also demanded Charles's personal attention. Months had elapsed, and Héricourt was unpunished. Béarn had not been reproved. René of Lorraine was formally admitted to the League of Constance on April 18, 1475, and was now ready openly to abjure the protection he had once accepted from Burgundy. There was a touch of old King René's theatrical taste in his grandson's method of dispatching the herald who rode up to the Duke's gorgeous tent of red velvet on May 10th. The man was, however, so overcome at the first view of Les Téméraires that he hastily delivered up his letter and threw down the blood-stained gauntlet, which he carried as a gage of war, without uttering a word. Then he fell on his knees, imploring the Duke's pardon. Charles was so little displeased at the signs of the impression his presence made that instead of being angry with the man, he gave him 12 florins for his good news. The terms of the declaration of war carried by the herald were as follows. To thee, Charles of Burgundy, in behalf of the very high, etc., Duke of Lorraine, my seigneur, I announce defiance, with fire and blood against thee, thy countries, thy subjects, thy allies, and other charge further have I not. The reply was straightforward. Herald, I have heard the exposition of thy charge, whereby thou hast given me subject for joy, and, to show you how matters are, thou shalt wear my robe with this gift, and shall tell thy master that I will find myself briefly in his land, and my greatest fear is that I may not find him. In order that thou mayest not be afraid to return, I desire my marshal and the king at arms of the Toison d'Or to convoy thee in perfect safety, for I should be sorry if thou didst not make thy report to thy master as befits a good and loyal officer. Thus was Charles pressed from the south and lured to the north. Excellent reason for obeying the order of the Pope's legate that Duke and Emperor must lay down arms under pain of excommunication did either belligerent refuse. The armistice accepted on May 28th was followed by a 9 months' truce signed on June 12th. It was a truce strictly to the advantage of Frederic and Charles. The Rhine cities, Louis XI, René of Lorraine, were alike ignored and disappointed in the expectations they had based on Frederic. End of Chapter 19. Recording by Stacy Dugan-Wilcox.
Chapter 20 of Charles the Bold, Last Duke of Burgundy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arturo Jr. 17. Charles the Bold, Last Duke of Burgundy, by Ruth Putnam. Chapter 20. The Campaigns of 1475. Monseigneur the Chancellor, I do not know what to write to you of the English, for thus far they have done nothing but dance at St. Omer, and we are not sure whether the King of England has landed. If he has, it must be with so small a force that it makes no noise, nor do the prisoners captured at Abbeville know anything. Nor do they believe that there will be any English here in 40 days. Tell the news to Monseigneur de Comminges, and recommend my interests to him, as I have confidence in him, and in Monseigneur de Thierry, and Monseigneur the Vice-Admiral. Thus wrote Louis XI in June. 2 days later, and he has heard of the truce. He seizes the occasion to express to the Privy Council of Bern his real opinion of the Emperor. So, Frederick has deserted us all. Well, it was not the first time. 30 years previous, when Louis was Dauphin, the Emperor had tried to turn the Swiss against him. Had not God, knowing the hearts of men, inspired the brave mountaineers, Louis would have been a victim of execrable treachery. The outcome had been wonderful, for an eternal friendship had sprung up between him and the Swiss, which must be preserved. Meantime, Charles has made his own definite plan of the campaign, which was to introduce Edward into Rheims for the coronation. The following letter from him to Edward IV bears no date, but it was evidently written at about the time of the truce. Honored Seigneur and brother, I recommend myself to you. I have listened carefully to your declaration through the pronotary, and understand that you do not wish to land without my advice, for which I thank you. I understand that some of your counselors think you had better land in Guienne, others in Normandy, others again at Calais. If you choose Guienne, you will be far from my assistance, but my brother of Brittany could help you. Still, it would be a long time before we could meet before Paris. As to Calais, you could not get enough provisions for your people, nor I for mine. Nor could the two forces make juncture without attack, and my brother of Brittany would be very far from both. To my mind, your best landing is Normandy, either at the mouth of the Seine or at La Hogue. I do not doubt that you will soon gain possession of cities and places, and you will be at the right hand of my brother of Brittany and of me. Tell me how many ships you want, and where you wish me to send them, and I will do it. On hearing further rumors of the actual arrival of the English, Louis hastened to Normandy to inspect the situation for himself. There he learned that his own naval forces, stationed in the Channel to ward off the invaders, had landed on the very day before his arrival, abandoning the task. When I heard that we took no action, I decided that my best plan would be to turn my people loose in Picardy and let them lay waste the country whence they, the English, expected to get their supplies. At the same time, the rumor that was permitted to be current in France was that Charles of Burgundy had been utterly defeated at Neuss, and that there was nothing whatsoever to apprehend from him. He, meanwhile, was continuing his own preparations by strenuous endeavors to levy more troops and to obtain fresh supplies. After the signing of the convention with the emperor, the Duke proceeded to Bruges to meet the Estates of Flanders. The answer to his demand for subsidies was a respectful refusal to furnish funds, on the plea that his expansion policy was ruining his lands. Counter-reproaches burst from Charles. He accused the deputies of leaving him in the lurch, and thus causing his failure at Neuss. Neither money, nor provisions, nor soldiers had they sent him as loyal subjects should. For whom does your prince labor? Is it for himself or for you, for your defense? You slumber, he watches. You nestle in warmth, he is cold. You are snug in your houses, while he is beaten by the wind and rain. He fasts, you gorge at your ease. Henceforth you shall be nothing more than subjects under a sovereign. I am, and I will be, master, bearding those who oppose me. Then, turning to the prelates, he continued, Do you obey diligently and without poor excuses, or your temporal goods shall be confiscated? To the nobles, Obey, or you shall lose your heads and your fiefs. Finally, he addressed the deputies of the Third Estate in a tone full of bitterness. And you eaters of good cities, if you do not obey my orders literally, as my chancellor will explain them to you, you shall forfeit privileges, property, and life. All the fervency of this adjuration failed to convince the deputies of their duty, as conceived by the orator. They declared that they had levied troops, and would levy more, for defense, but that the 4 members of Flanders were agreed that they would contribute nothing to offensive measures. Charles must accept their decision as his sainted father had done. The details of all the aid they had given him, 2,500 men for Neuss, and many other contributions, were recapitulated. Flanders had been generous indeed. The concluding phrases of their answer were as follows. As to your last letters, requiring that within 15 days every man capable of bearing arms report at Ath, these were orders impossible of execution, and unprofitable for you yourself. Your subjects are merchants, artisans, laborers, unfitted for arms. Strangers would quit the land. Commerce, in which your noble ancestors have for 400 years maintained the land, commerce, most redoubtable, Signor, is irreconcilable with war. This answer gave the true key to the situation. The estates of Flanders were determined to be bled no further for schemes in which they did not sympathize. When this memorial was presented to Charles, he broke out into fresh invective about the base ingratitude of the Flemish. "Take back your paper," were his last words. "Make your own answer. Talk as you wish, but do your duty." This was on July 12th. Charles had no further time to waste in argument. He was still convinced that the burghers would, in the end, yield to his demands. With a small escort, Charles left Bruges and reached Calais on July 14th, where he had been preceded by the Duchess, eager to greet her brother, who had actually landed on July 4th, with the best equipped army, about 24,000 men, that had ever left the shores of England, and the latest inventions in besieging engines. The expedition proved a wretched failure, a miserable disappointment to the English at home, who had been lavish in their contributions. Charles seems to have been put out by the place of landing. His own plan is clear from the letter quoted. He wished the two armies of Edward and himself to sweep a large stretch of territory as they marched toward each other. The one thing that he objected to was a consolidation of the two forces. Incapacity to turn an unexpected or an unwelcome situation to account was one of the Duke's most deeply ingrained characteristics. He showed no inventiveness or resourcefulness. He held his own army at a distance from the English, much to the invader's chagrin, who was forced to march unaided over regions rendered inhospitable by Louis's stern orders, and outside of cities ready to hold him at bay. "If you do not put yourself in a state of security, it will be necessary to destroy the city, to our regret," was the king's message to Rheims, and the most skillful of French engineers was fully prepared to make good the words. Open hostilities were avoided. Edward camped on the field of Agincourt, where perhaps he dreamed of his ancestors' success, but no fresh blaze of old English glory illuminated his path. He did not proceed to Paris. There was no coronation at Rheims, no comfortable reception within any gates at all, for Charles was as chary as Louis himself of giving the English a foothold, though he advised Edward to accept an invitation from St. Paul to visit St. Quentin. This, however, proved another disappointment. Just as Edward was ready to enter, the gates opened to let out a troop which effectually repulsed the advancing foreigners. The Count of St. Paul had changed his mind. "It is a miserable existence, this of ours, when we take toil and trouble enough to shorten our life, writing and saying things exactly opposite to our thoughts," writes the keenest observer of this elaborate network of pompous falsehoods, wherein every action was entangled. Louis XI trusted no one but himself, while he played with the trust of all, and his game was the safest. His fear of the invaders was soon allayed. "These English are of different metal from those whom you used to know. They keep close, they attempt nothing," he wrote to the veteran Damartin. It was, indeed, a patent fact that Edward was not a foe to be feared. Baffled and discouraged, he readily opened his ears to his French brother, and Louis heaped grateful recognition on every Englishman who helped incline his sovereign to peaceful negotiations. Velvet and coin did their work. Edward was easily led into the path of least resistance, and an interview between the rival kings was appointed for August 29th. Great preparations were made for their meeting on a bridge at Picquigny, across which a grating was erected, Like Pyramus and Thisbe, the two princes kissed each other through the barriers, and exchanged assurances of friendship. Edward was, indeed, so easy to convince that Louis was in absolute terror lest his English brother would accept his invitation to show him Paris before his return. No wonder Edward was deceived, for Louis was definite in his hospitable offers, suggesting that he would provide a confessor willing to give absolution for pleasant sins. The Duke was duly forewarned of this colloquy. On August 18th, he was staying at Peronne, whence he paid a visit to the English camp. It was ended without any intimation of Edward's change of heart towards the French king, whom he had come to depose, though his plan was then ripe. On the 20th, Charles received a written communication with the news which Edward had disliked broaching orally, and was officially informed that the king had yielded to the wishes of his army, and was considering a treaty with Louis XI, wherein Edward's dear brother of Burgundy should receive honorable mention did he desire it. On hearing these most unwelcome tidings, Charles set off for the English camp in hot haste, attended by a small escort, and nursing his wrath as he rode. King Edward was rather alarmed at the Duke's aspect when the latter appeared, and asked whether he would not like a private interview. Charles disregarded his question. "Is it true? Have you made peace?" he demanded. Edward's attempt at smooth explanations was blocked by a flood of invectives poured out by Charles, who remembered himself sufficiently to speak in English so that the bystanders might have the full benefit of his passionate reproaches. He spared nothing, comparing the lazy, sensual, pleasure-loving monarch, whose easeful ways were rapidly increasing his weight of flesh, with the heroism of other English Edwards with whom he was proud to claim kin. As to the offers to remember his interests in the perfidious peace that perfidious Albion was about to swear with equally perfidious France, his rejection was scornful indeed. "Negotiate for me! Arbitrate for me! Is it I who wanted the French crown? Leave me to make my own truce. I will wait until you have been 3 months oversea." Among those who witnessed the scene were several Englishmen who sympathized with Charles. If we may believe Comines. "The Duke of Burgundy has said the truth," declared the Duke of Gloucester, and many agreed with him. Having given vent to his sentiments, Charles hurried away from his disappointing ally and reached Namur on the 22nd, where he spent the night. Edward troubled himself little about his brother-in-law's summary of his character. He was tired of camp hardships, and both he and his men found it very refreshing to have Amiens open her gates to them at the order of Louis XI. Food and wine were lavished upon all alike. It was a delightful experience for the English soldiers to see tables groaning with good things spread in the very streets, and to be bidden to order what they would at the taverns with no consideration for the reckoning. They enjoyed good French fare, free of charge, until their host intimated to King Edward that his men were very intoxicated, and that there were limits in all things. But Louis did not spare his money or his pains until he was sure that a bloodless victory had been won. He fully realized the importance of extravagant expenditure in order to reach the goal he had set himself. "We must have the whole sum at Amiens before Friday evening, besides what will be wanted for private gratifications to my Lord Howard, and others who have had part in the arrangement. Do not fail in this, that there may be no pretext for a rupture of what has been already settled." Though they had now no rood of land, the English returned richer than they came, and they eased their amour-propre by calling the sums that had changed hands tribute money. "Right Reverend and my most tender and kind Moudre, I recommend me to you. Please it you to weet that blessed be God. This voyage of the king's is finished for this time, and all the king's ost is comen to Calais as on Monday last past. That is to say, the 4th day of September, and at this day many of his host be passed the sea into England again, and in especial my Lord of Norfolk, and my brethren. I also mislike somewhat the hair here, for by my trout I was in good heal when I come hither, and all whole and to my wedding I had never a better stomach in my life, and now in 8 days I am crazied again. Thus wrote one Englishman from Calais, and doubtless many others found the air more wholesome at home. Charles of Burgundy was now ready to consider the affairs of Lorraine. He advised Renée of his intentions in a manifesto which reached him on September 5th. The preamble contained a long list of the manifold benefits conferred upon Lorraine by the House of Burgundy. Then Renée was admonished to observe in every particular the terms of his own treaty with Charles, which he, Renée, had signed voluntarily, or the former would make him know the difference between his friendship and his enmity. This menace was ominous to the poor Duke of Lorraine, for on September 13th, his friend Louis XI had signed a fresh treaty with Charles of Burgundy at Soleure, and Campobasso was marching mercenaries in Burgundian pay towards the unfortunate duchy. In other words, the French king abandoned the young protégé whom he had spared no pains to alienate from Burgundian protection. It was a moment when his one interest apparently was to settle accounts with the Count of St. Paul, who had been equally treacherous in his dealings with England, Burgundy, and France. Having rested during the summer, the Burgundian troops were in fine trim when Charles marched to Nancy, taking towns on the way, and sat down before the capital in the last week of October. From his camp he wrote to the Duke of Milan, "Very dear brother, I recommend myself to you. I have just accepted a truce with the king for 9 years to come, in the form and manner contained at length in the copy of the articles which I have given to your ambassador, resident with me. And be sure, fratello mio, that nothing would have induced me to accept the truce had you not been comprised therein. And, similarly, you must be satisfied in all the pacts between the king and myself, just as you were comprised in the convention lately made at Neuss. For the rest, I have heard from your ambassador about the troops that can be furnished me, for which I am well content, praying you continue to serve me in accordance with the promises of your ambassador. As to the coming of your brother to me, Sforza, Duc de Berry, I should be very glad. He has no reason now for delay, as he can travel in Lorraine as safely as in Lombardy, as I have said to your ambassador. Pray the Lord to give you the desires of your heart. Written in my camp at Nancy, the penultimate day of October, 1475. Charles." Some trifling assistance was offered to Renée by Strasbourg and other foes to Burgundy, but it was wholly insufficient to rescue him from his difficulties, and he was finally obliged to order the capitulation of Nancy on November 19th. The magistrates desired to hold out, but were forced by the populace to submit, and on November 30th, 1475, Charles of Burgundy marched triumphantly through the gate of Crafts into the capital of Lorraine, where he was received as the sovereign duke. This time, Charles acted the role of a merciful and diplomatic conqueror. There was no cruelty permitted, and every evidence of conciliation was shown. The majority of the Lorrainers accepted the new order of things without further protest. At the end of December, Charles convened the estates of Lorraine in the ducal palace, addressed them as his subjects of Burgundy, promised to be a good prince, demanded their attachment, confided his plans of expansion, and announced his intention of making Nancy the capital of his states. Again the Duke's star rose. This acquisition seemed a sign of the reality of his dreams. Even before the fall of Nancy, his approaching success bore fruit, inasmuch as the Emperor changed the late convention into a firmer treaty signed on November 17th. Indeed, had Charles died at that moment, there would have been little doubt that his dreamed-of kingdom had been simply prevented by a mere accident. The detailed story of all that had happened in the Swiss Confederation and the Lower Union since their formal declaration of war against Charles is too complicated to relate. At the beginning of 1476, the situation was, briefly, that Sigismund held the debated mortgaged lands, while the Swiss allies, with Bern as the most militant member of the League, had continued to carry on offensive operations against the Duke and his allies, notably the Duchess of Savoy. The conquest of Lorraine caused a panic, especially in the face of the fresh agreements between the Duke and the Emperor and the King. There was a short period of hesitation, marked by a truce, till January 1st, 1476, between Charles and the Confederates, a period when the timid among the allies urged their counsel of reconciliation at all hazards. Charles, too, seems to have desired an accord rather than hostilities, even though he still bore the Swiss a bitter grudge for Héricourt. It was probably appeals from Yolande of Savoy that decided him to open a campaign in midwinter. "The prince has been so busy for a week past," wrote the Milanese ambassador, "in the reorganization of his army according to new ordinances, and in the regulation of his receipts and outlays, that he has scarcely given himself time to eat once in 24 hours. He is importuned by the Duchess of Savoy and the Count of Romont for aid against the Swiss, who respect no treaty, and do not cease increasing their forces. In consequence, Duke Charles intends leaving Nancy in 6 days to go towards the Jura. He expects to take with him 2,300 lances and 10,000 ordnance, which, joined to the feudal militia of Burgundy and Savoy, will swell his army to the number of 25,000 combatants. His operations are so planned that he will have more to gain than to lose." When Charles left Nancy on January 11th, he issued one of his grandiloquent manifestos, declaring that he was acting in behalf of all princes and seigneurs who had suffered wrong at the hands of the Swiss, and that he was ready to punish all who had provoked his just wrath by ravaging his province of Burgundy. It was rather a curious act on his part to let his chief mercenary captain go off to make a pilgrimage just as he was on the eve of a campaign. But so he did, granting Campobasso leave of absence to visit the shrine of St. James at Compostela, a leave possibly utilized by the Italian to further the understanding with Louis XI, at which he arrived later. On across the Jura marched the Burgundian army, while the Swiss Diet came to a slow and confused decision to prepare to meet him. He did not take the route generally expected, directly towards Bern, his chief antagonist, but turned aside and attacked the little fortress of Granson. The castle was not overstrong. Efforts to provision it by water failed, and finally, on February 28th, after a brief siege, the captain of the garrison, Hans Weiler, capitulated to the Duke's German forces, who represented to them that Charles was as generous as he was magnificent. If the Milan ambassador can be trusted, the surrender was unconditional. Charles was soon on the spot. The 412 soldiers, who had succeeded in holding the Burgundian army at bay for 10 whole days, were made to march past his tent with bowed heads. Then he ordered one and all to be hanged, reserving 2 to help in the executions. 4 hours were occupied in fulfilling these pitiless orders. Panigarola arrived in the camp on the 29th. It was leap year, 1476, and found this accomplished, and saw the bodies hanging on the trees, but he asserts that no word was broken. Charles was now absolutely confident of complete success. "Bellorum eventus dubiae sunt," remarked the prudent Milanese, however, and he was proved right. When the allied forces of the mountaineers finally arrived in the Duke's neighborhood, a hot-pitched battle ensued. The Burgundians, led by the Duke in person, were thrown into utter confusion. The mercenaries, terrified by the uncouth yells and battle cries of Uri and Unterwalden, simply lost their heads and did nothing. Charles was pushed on as far as Jung. it was not only a defeat, but a complete rout. When the Swiss came in sight of the late garrison hanged to the trees, their rage knew no bounds. In their turn, they massacred, hanged, and drowned every one in Burgundian pay whom they could lay hands upon. The Burgundians saved their lives when they could, but their valuable artillery and their baggage, the mass of riches that Charles carried with him, were ruthlessly sacrificed and gathered up contemptuously as booty by the Swiss, who cared little for the tapestries and jewels, though they prized the gold. Such was the Battle of Granson on the 2nd of March. The fatal mistake committed by Charles was that he despised his enemy and underestimated his quality as well as his strength. Just before engaging in battle, the whole Swiss army fell upon their knees in prayer that the issue might be successful. This action deceived Charles into thinking that they were cowardly, and his opinion was shared by his men. A contemptuous laugh broke out from the Burgundian ranks. Olivier de la Marche ends a meagre account of Granson with the following rather barren words. In short, the Duke of Burgundy lost the day, and was pushed back as far as Jung, where he stopped, and it is meet that I tell how the Duke's bodyguard saved themselves, and reached Salins, where I saw them arrive, for I was not present at the battle on account of a malady I suffered. From Jung, the Duke went to Noceret, and you can understand that he was very sad and melancholy at having lost the battle, where his rich baggage was stolen and his army shattered. On March 21st, 1476, Sir John Paston writes to Margaret Paston from Calais. As for tidings here, we hear from alla the world. Etem the Duke of Burgoyne hath conquered Lorraine, and Queen Margaret shall not now be likelihood have it. Wherefore the French king cherisheth her but easily. But after this conquest of Lorraine, the Duke took great courage to go upon the land of the Swiss, to conquer them, but the bearded him at an onset place, and hath distrusted him, and hath slain the most part of his vanguard, and won all his ordnance and artillery, and moreover all stuff that he had in his host with him, except men and horse fled not, but they rode that night 20 mile. And so the rich sallets, helmets, garters, nouches, skelt, and all is gone, with tent, pavilions, and all, and so mend, dame his pride is abated. Men told him that they were forward carlies, but he would not believe it, and yet men say that he will to them again. God speed them both. Many of the rumors that were current represented Charles as completely prostrated by his disaster. This was only half true. His efforts to retrieve himself were immediate, but physically, he certainly showed the effects of this campaign. He was attacked by a low fever. His stomach rejected food. Insomnia afflicted his nights, and dropsical swellings appeared on his legs. This condition was attributed to his fatigues and exposure in a hard climate, and to his habit of drinking warm barley water in the morning. He was urged to use a soft feather bed instead of his hard couch, while Yolanda's own physician and one Angelo Catto watched anxiously over him. The latter claimed the credit of saving his life. Charles was not, however, fully recovered when he resumed his activities and held a review on May 9th. With all his efforts exerted in every quarter likely to yield results, the whole number of troops was but 20,000 men. Every onlooker felt that the Duke was now trying to accomplish something quite beyond his resources. "Illustrious Prince," wrote the King of Hungary, "we cannot sufficiently wonder that you should have been so gravely deceived, and that, after having once found that you were lured into loss and disgrace, again you let yourself be snared in a labyrinth from which you will either never escape, or escape only with damage and shame. Without risk to himself, your foe has precipitated you into an abyss, and tied you where you are exposed to the loss of your possessions and your life. We exhort you to pause before incurring heavier losses, and greater dangers. If fortune smiles upon you in your attack on that people, you will have the whole empire against you. In the opposite event, which God avert, it will be turned into a common tale how a mighty prince was overcome by rustics whom there would have been no honor in conquering, while to be conquered by them would be an eternal disgrace. This plain-spoken epistle failed to reach its destination until after the prophecy had been fulfilled. Its warning would probably have been futile had Charles read it before he marched on towards Bern on June 8th. On the road that he chose lay the town of Morat, which had made ready for his approach. A few days to reduce it, and then on to Bern was his plan. His force succeeded in holding the ground and cutting off communication with Bern for 3 days. On the 14th, a messenger made his way through from the beleaguered city to Bern, and all the allies were then urged to do their best. The result was encouraging. "There are 3 times as many as at Granson, but let no one be dismayed. With God's help, we will kill them all," wrote a leader of Bern. The encounter came on June 23rd. The force was really a formidable one. René of Lorraine was among the commanders on the side of the Swiss. It was a tremendous fight, brief as it was savage. At 2 o'clock, the assault was made, and within an hour Charles was repulsed. Almost all the infantry perished. The slain is estimated variously from 10 to 22,000. Charles did not keep his vow to perish if defeated. To his assured allies he clung closely, and none had more reason to be faithful to him than Yolande of Savoy. After Granson he hastened to give the Duchess his own view of the disaster. "It has given me a singular pleasure to hear of your calmness and constancy of soul, for the thought of your affliction weighed more heavily upon me than what has befallen me. Every day diminishes the inconvenience and proves that the loss in men is less than we thought. Such as it is, it came from a mere skirmish. The bulk of the armies did not engage, to my great displeasure. Had they fought, the victory would have been mine. There has been none on either side. God, I trust, reserves it for you and for me. The hope you have placed in me shall not be in vain." Thus he wrote on March 7th to encourage his anxious protégé. After the second defeat, it was to her that the Duke turned again. In the very early morning after the Battle of Morat, Charles paused at Morges on the Lake of Geneva, having ridden hard through the night. There he heard Mass, breakfasted, rested a while, and then rode on, reaching the castle of Gex at 6 o'clock in the evening, where Yolande of Savoy was waiting his coming, in full knowledge of the second disaster he had suffered. At the foot of the staircase, attended by her ladies, Yolande was waiting to greet her disappointed friend. Charles dismounted and kissed each member of the family in order of precedence. The little Duke, his brother, then the Duchess, her daughter, and the ladies in waiting. Yolande had had time to move out of her own suite of apartments, and have them prepared for her guests' use. And there the two talked together confidentially, while their attendants waited patiently just out of earshot. Then Charles formally escorted his hostess to her son's room, returning to his own, showing signs of extreme fatigue. Panigarola was absent, but another Milanese was among her suite, and he pressed forward as the Duke re-entered the apartment, offering to carry any message to the Duke of Milan, to be cut short with, "It is well, that is enough." Shortly afterwards, Olivier de la Marche and the Sire de Givry, commander of the Burgundians dedicated to Yolande's service, were summoned, and had a long conference with Charles. Yolande was, apparently, more communicative to the Milanese Appiano than to Charles, but he saw that she was not frank with him. "She must throw herself on the protection of France or of Milan," he wrote to his master. She was, however, clear in her own mind, that she would not accept Sforza's protection any more than that of Charles. She absolutely refused to identify her fortunes with the latter. She was determined to go to Geneva, but no farther. The Duke remained at Gex until the 27th, and renewed his arguments to persuade her to cross the Jura with him. She was firm in adhering to her own plan. The two parties set out from the castle together, their roads lying in opposite directions, but Charles escorted his hostess about halfway to Geneva, riding beside her carriage, and continuing his persuasions in a low voice. At last he drew up his rein, gave her a farewell kiss, and rode off. He was much displeased at her determination, and he speedily resolved upon other methods of making sure of her fidelity to him. Lamarche thus relates the story. After the Duke had been discomfited the second time by the Swiss before Morat, believing that he could do the thing secretly, he made a plan to kidnap Madame of Savoy and her children and take them to Burgundy, and he ordered me, I being at Geneva, on my head to capture Madame of Savoy and her children and bring them to him. In order to obey my prince and master, I did his behest quite against my heart, and I took Madame and her children near the gate of Geneva. But the Duke of Savoy was stolen away from me, for it was 2 o'clock in the night, by the means of some of our own company who were subjects of the Duke of Savoy, and, assuredly, they did no more than their duty. What I did was simply to save my life, for the Duke, my master, was the kind that insisted on having his will done under penalty of losing one's head. So I took my way, and carried Madame of Savoy behind me, and her 2 daughters followed, and 2 or 3 of her maids, and we took the road over the mountain to reach St. Claude. I was well assured of the second son, and had him carried by a gentleman. I thought I was assured of the Duke of Savoy, but he was stolen from me, as I said. As soon as we were at a distance, the people of the Duchess, and especially the Seigneur de Menthon, had torches brought, and took the Duke back to Geneva, in which they had great joy, and I, with Madame of Savoy and the little boy, who was not the Duke, crossed the mountain in the black night, and came to a place called Mijou, and thence to St. Cloud. You must know that the Duke gave very bad cheer to the company, and chiefly to me. I was in danger of my life because I had not brought the Duke of Savoy. Then the Duke went on to Salins without speaking to me or giving me any orders. However, I escorted Madame of Savoy after him, and he ordered me to take her to the castle of Rochefort. Thence she was taken to Rouvre in Burgundy. After that I had nothing more to do with her or her affairs. This queer story is undoubtedly true, and the tone in which Lamarche relates it indicates that he, too, was alienated by the Duke's manner, and might have been more willing to lend an ear to Louis's suggestions than he had been 5 years previously. It is not evident that he played his master false, or that he was cognizant of the recapture of the little Duke, but he says himself that he thought the attendants were absolutely justified in it. It is after this incident that the astute Panigarola returns and joins the Duke's suite at Salins. He finds Charles a changed man, indulging in strange fits of hilarity, expressing the wish that a couple of thousand more of his troops had been killed, French at heart as they were. He refused to see Yolande, after thus forcibly obtaining the means of so doing, and sent her to the castle of the Sire of Rochefort for safekeeping. Abstemious as he had been all his life, never taking wine without water, the strong Burgundy in which he now suddenly indulged went to his head. Rumors went abroad that his mental balance was shaken. That does not seem to have been true to the extent of insanity. He was only infinitely chagrined, but he certainly put on a brave front, and retained his self-confidence, and declared, "They are wrong if they believe me defeated. Providence has provided me with so many people and estates, with such abundant resources, that many such defeats would be needed to ruin them. At the moment when the world imagines that I am annihilated, I will reopen the campaign with an army of 150,000 men." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arturo Jr. 17. Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy, by Ruth Putnam. Chapter 21. The Battle of Nancy, 1477. It was manifestly impossible for Charles to attempt to retrieve his fortunes without having large sums of ready money at his command. He therefore proceeded to appeal to the guardians of each and every treasury in his various states. Flanders and Burgundy were, however, the only quarters whence succor was in the least probable. The estates of the latter duchy met, deliberated, and resolved to make no pretense nor to yield anything contrary to the duty which everyone owes to his country. A certain Sieur de Jarville, accompanied by other true Burgundians, undertook to report the proceedings to Charles, a duty usually falling to the share of the presiding officer of the ecclesiastical chamber. The message which he carried was laconic, but sturdy. "Tell monsieur that we are humble and brave subjects and servitors, but as to what is asked in his behalf, it never has been done. It cannot be done. It never will be done." "Small people would never dare use such language," is the comment of the Burgundian chronicler, proud of the temerity of his fellow countrymen. In the Netherlands, the individual estates were equally emphatic in their refusal to meet the Duke's wishes. Charles, therefore, resolved to call together a general assembly of deputies in the hope of finding them collectively more amenable. Writs of summons were issued very widely, and a States General was formally convened at Ghent on Friday, April 26th, 1476. At the last assembly of this nature, in 1473, the Duke had expressly promised, in consideration of an annual grant of 500,000 crowns for 6 years then accorded to him, to refrain from further demands, and there was a spirit of sullen resentment in the air when this session, whose purpose was plain, was opened by Chancellor Huguenet. He set forth 3 points for consideration. Monseigneur wished his daughter Mary, that most precious jewel, to join him in Burgundy. A suitable escort was necessary to ensure her safe journey, and that the Duke requested the States to provide. Secondly, he desired the States to endorse a levy of fresh troops to meet his immediate requirements. Further, he requested each town to equip a specified number of horses at its own expense. He demanded the service of his tenants, fief, and arrière-fief, and in addition he required that all other men, no matter what their condition, able to bear arms, should enlist or provide a substitute. A portion of the troops should be set to guard the frontier, and the rest should be sent to the Duke in Burgundy. It was a demand, pure and simple, for a universal call to arms, a national levy. The Duke's paternal desire to see his daughter was the flimsiest of excuses that deceived no one for a moment. After the Chancellor's exposition, there was probably adjournment for discussion. The pensionary of Brussels, Gort Rollants, then acted as spokesman to present the following report, as the result of their deliberations, to the Duchess Regent. As for Mademoiselle of Burgundy, the deputies would ascertain the wishes of their principals, but the second request did not call for a referendum. The representatives were fully capable of settling the matter at once. Considering the heavy burdens laid on the people, and taking into account the promises made to them in 1473 that no further demands should be made on the public purse, the 3 estates concurred in humbly petitioning Monseigneur to excuse them from granting his request. It was on a Sunday, after dinner, April 28th, when this decision was communicated to the Duchess in her own hotel. After a private colloquy between her and Huguenet, the Chancellor told the messenger that it was quite right for the deputies to consult their principals before the heiress was permitted to leave the guardianship of her faithful subjects. That was a grave matter, but surely there was no reason why her escort could not be determined upon at once. In regard to the levees, Madame was not empowered to take any excuse. It was beyond her province. Since the opening of the assembly, fresh letters had arrived from the Duke urging the speedy execution of his previous instructions. The Chancellor then appointed a committee to meet a committee from the States at 8 a.m. on the morrow at the convent of the Augustines. This was not satisfactory. Huguenet was speedily notified that the States did not feel empowered to appoint a committee. The most they could do was to resolve themselves into a committee of the whole. The objection to this was that a small conference was far better suited to free discussion. It was easy for unqualified persons to enter the session of a large body. The States, however, were tenacious in their opinion that their writs did not qualify them to appoint committees. Every point must be threshed out in the presence of every deputy. Potestas delegata non deleganda est. There was further negotiation, and it was not until Monday afternoon that Huguenet's commissioner brought a conciliatory message that if the gentleman were so bent on it, he would, in spite of the difficulty of discussion in an open meeting, talk over both points with them in full assembly. Again the States objected. They had no instructions whatsoever in regard to Mademoiselle, and could not discuss her movements either in public or in private session. As to levies, they repeated in detail all previous arguments, and expressed a fervent hope that Monseigneur would withdraw the request. It would in the end be more to Monseigneur's advantage, etc. Back and forth traveled the commissioner between States and Duchess. The latter simply reiterated her dictum that Mary must certainly set forth to visit her father in May with an adequate escort, in whose ranks must appear 3 prelates, 3 or 4 barons, 50 knights, and notable men from the good towns, well armed. The States were then resolved into a committee of the whole for a private deliberation, an action that probably enabled them to exclude the embarrassing spectators. In preparation for this, the diligent commissioner called apart one deputy from each contingent and expatiated on the Duke's need of proof of sturdy loyalty. 7,000 to 8,000 combatants, besides Mademoiselle's escort, and the fiefs and arrear fiefs, Monseigneur could manage to make suffice for the present, and these must be provided. These confidences were at once reported to the Assembly, which then adjourned to think over the matter during the night. When they met again on April 30th, the Chancellor was ready with a new message from Madame. Go home now, consult your principals, and return on May 15th. On the motion of some deputy, this date was changed to May 24th. Precautions were taken to prevent any binding action in the interim. Moreover, the exact phrasing of the reports to the separate groups of constituents was also agreed upon by the majority of the deputies. In this, Hainaut refused to participate, as in that province there was a reluctance to deny the obligations of the fiefs. When the deputies reassembled a month later, Huguenet tried to weaken the effect of their answer by a suggestion that it had better not be considered the final decision, but a mere informal expression of opinion. There were so many strangers present, etc. The States determinedly refused to be trifled with. Madame must not be displeased if they gave the result of their deliberations in the presence of the whole assembly, not by way of opinion, but as a formal and conclusive report. Their charge was restricted to this manner of procedure. The Chancellor, interrupting them, asked, since their charge was thus restricted, whether they had also been limited in the number of times they might drink on their way. The answer was, Chancellor, come now, say what you wish. The answer shall be given as it was meant to be given. The communication was so long that its delivery took from 3 to 8 p.m. It was nothing more than a detailed apology for refusing the sovereign's demands. Several days more were consumed in unsuccessful efforts to cajole or browbeat the deputies into a more genial mood. The only concessions offered were insignificant, and to their resolution the deputies held firmly. According to current rumor, concludes Gort Rolland's story, the ducal council would gladly have accepted a notable sum in lieu of the service of towns and of the fief holders, but the states made no such offer. There was evidently a hope that better results might be obtained from a new assembly, but none was held, and the most earnest endeavors of the duke's wife and daughter failed to arouse enthusiasm for his plans. Moreover, when there seemed a prospect that the Netherlands might be attacked from France, the sympathy of even the Duchess and Council for offensive operations was chilled. Not only did Margaret fail to send her husband the extra supplies demanded, but she decided to appropriate the 3 months' subsidy, the chief item of regular ducal revenue for protection of the Flemish frontier, an action that made Charles very angry. Defenses at home. Yes, indeed, they were necessary, but the people must provide them. The subsidy was lawfully his, and he needed every penny of it. His army had not been destroyed. He was simply obliged to strengthen it. Burgundy was helping him. Flanders must do her part. They were deaf to this appeal, although a generous message was sent saying that if he were hard-pressed, they would go in person to rescue him from danger. The story of the assembly of the estates of the two Burgundys is equally interesting as a picture of the clash between sovereign will and popular unreadiness to open the carefully guarded money boxes. The deputies convened at Salins on July 8th in the presence of the Duke himself. The session was opened by Jean de Grey, the president of the Parliament of the Duchy, with a brief statement of the sovereign's needs. Then Charles took the floor and delivered a tremendous harangue with a marvelous command of language. Panigarola declared that his allusions to parallel crises in ancient times were so apt and so fluent that it seemed as though the book of history lay opened before him and that he read from its pages. The impression he made was plain to see. His demands for aid to retrieve the Swiss disasters were open and above board this time. There was no such pretense put forward as the escort of Mary. The argument was that any ruler, backed by his people, unanimous in their willingness to give their last jewel for public purposes, must inevitably succeed in his righteous wars, etc. His learned and able discourse was well received, according to other reporters besides the Milanese, but there was no hearty yielding to sentiment in the reply. 4 days were consumed in deliberation before that was ready on July 12th. They had certainly considered that the grant of 100,000 florins annually for 6 years, accorded 2 years previously, was their share. But in view of the Duke's appeal, they would endeavor to aid him. Let him stipulate which cities he wished fortified, and they would assume charge of the work. 2 favors they begged: that Charles should not rashly expose his person, for he was the sole prince of his glorious house, and that he should be ready to receive overtures of peace. "We will give life and property for defense, but we implore you to take no offensive step." Charles did not perhaps feel the distrust of his military skill and of his judgment that these words implied. Financial stress was not the Duke's only difficulty in 1476. The defection of his allies continued. Yolande, that former good friend of his, was now a fervent suppliant to Louis XI, begging him to restore her to freedom and to her son's estates. Not that her restraint was in itself hard to bear. At Rouvres, whither she had been removed from Rochefort, she was free to do what she wished, except to depart. Couriers, too, were at her service apparently, who carried uninspected letters to Milan, Geneva, Nice, Turin, and to Louis XI. Comines says that she hesitated to take refuge with the last lest he should promptly return her to Burgundian protection. Yet her brother's hatred to Charles seemed a fairly strong assurance against such action. Louis XI was never so genial as when hearing some ill of Charles. "From what I have learned, I believe his Turk, his devil in this world, the person he loathes most intensely, is the Duke of Burgundy, with whom he can never live in amity." These words were sent by Pietrasanta to the Duke of Milan, who was also turning slowly, with some periods of hesitation, to an alliance with Louis, now engaged in following the hare with a cart. On his side, the king declared that he had no intention of troubling further about his obligations to the Duke of Burgundy. "He has himself broken the truce repeatedly. I can begin a war when I please, but I have thought it best to temporize." In the succeeding weeks, Louis plunged deeper and deeper into negotiations with any and everyone whom he could turn against Charles. In October, Sire de Chaumont, governor of Champagne, the territory that Edward IV had failed to consign to the Duke's sovereignty, made a descent on Rouvres and rescued Yolande of Savoy. There was no attempt to stay her departure, and she was scrupulous, so it is said, in leaving money behind to pay for the Burgundian property carried off in her train, though it were nothing but an old crossbow. "Welcome, Madame the Burgundian," was the fraternal salutation which she received on her arrival at her brother's court. She replied that she was a good French woman, and quite ready to obey His Majesty's commands. During the summer, Charles remained at La Rivière, exerting every effort to levy an army. It was no easy task, and the review held on July 27th showed a meager return for his exertions. But he did not slacken his efforts. Lists were immediately drawn up showing the vacancies in each company, and his money stress did not prevent his offering increased pay as an extra inducement to recruits. "An excellent means of encouragement," comments Panigarola. The necessity for his preparations was evident. An opportune legacy, inherited by René of Lorraine, enabled that dispossessed prince to work to better advantage than he had been able to do since Charles had convened the estates of Lorraine at Nancy. Moreover, on the very day of the review of the deficient Burgundian troops, a Swiss Diet at Fribourg adopted resolutions regarding a closer alliance with René. Louis XI ostensibly maintained his truce with Charles, but he had intimated that a French army would wait in Dauphiné, ready to help adjust the affairs of Savoy, and, at about the same time when Yolande was at court, he gave a gracious reception to a Swiss embassy, so that René did not feel himself without support as he advanced to recover his city. The mercenaries left by Charles at Nancy were weak and indifferent. A brief siege, and the capital of Lorraine capitulated to Duke René. Charles was too late to prevent this mortifying loss. His forces, too, were a mere shadow. 3,000 to 4,000 men rallied round him in the Franche-Comté, a few hundred joined him in Burgundy, and as he skirted the frontier of Champagne, he received slight reinforcements from Luxembourg. Then came Campobasso and his mercenary troops, and the Count of Chimay with such Flemish fiefs as had individually respected the Duke's appeal. In all, the forces at Charles's disposition amounted to about 10,000, far fewer than those at Neuss or at Granson. At a diet of October 17th, the compact between René and the Swiss was confirmed, and the former was assured of efficient aid to help him repulse Charles in his advance into Lorraine. There was need. The city of Toul refused admission to both dukes, but furnished provision for Charles's troops, so that for the moment he was the better off of the two. René then proceeded to provision Nancy and to prepare it for a siege, while he himself proceeded to Pont-à-Mousson, and for several days the two adversaries were only separated by the Moselle. Charles's army was augmented daily by slight accessions from Flanders, and England, and by fragments of the garrisons of the towns in Lorraine that had yielded to René, and the latter fell back little by little. Charles, in his turn, held Pont-à-Mousson and proceeded along the road to Nancy, not deterred by the Lorrainers. It was on October 22nd that Charles of Burgundy laid siege for the second time to Nancy. In thus entering into active hostilities, he was ignoring the advice of his councillors, who were unanimous in begging him to devote the winter months to refitting his army in Luxembourg or Flanders. His position was really very dangerous. He had no base on which to rest, as he had recovered no towns except Pont-à-Mousson. But he ignored the patent obstacles and tried assault after assault upon Nancy. All most valiantly repulsed. Within the walls, there was an amazing display of courage, energy, and good humor. As a matter of fact, the Duke's reputation had waned, while the fear of his cruelty emboldened the burghers to hold out to the last ditch. Any fate would be better than falling into his hands, was the general opinion. Throughout Lorraine, the captains of the garrisons seized every occasion to harry the Burgundians. Familiar with the lay of the land, with every crossroad and bypath, they were able to lie in wait for the foragers and to do much damage. 400 cavaliers coming up from Burgundy were attacked by one Malhortier de Rosières and literally cut to pieces, while their horses changed sides with ease. Only a few escaped to report the fate of the others to Charles. Not long after, Malhorty, encouraged by this success, crept up to the Burgundian camp, fell upon the sleepers, and captured a goodly number of horses. The troops on which Charles counted most confidently were Campobasso's. Several attempts were made to warn him that treachery was possible in that quarter if the commander were too much exasperated by delays in payment, too much tried by the ill temper of his employer. But the Duke persisted in being oblivious to what was passing under his eyes. Thus, while awaiting the moment for his final defection, the Italian found it possible to enter into communication with René and to retard the operations of the siege, so as to give time for the advance of the army of relief. The weather of this year was a marked contrast to the mild season of 1473. The winter set in early, and the cold became very severe, almost at once. Their sufferings made the burghers very impatient for the relief, of whose coming they could get no certain assurance. The Burgundian lines were held so rigidly that the interchange of messages between the city and her friends was rendered very difficult. One Suffren de Bachy tried to slip through to Nancy, to tell the besieged that René was levying troops in Switzerland and would soon be with them. Bachy fell into the Duke's hands and was immediately hanged. One story says that Campobasso was among the interceders for his life and received a box on the ear for his pains, an insult that proved the last straw in his allegiance to Charles. Comines, however, declares that the Italian urged the death of the captive, fearful of the premature betrayal of his own intended treachery. This execution was one of those arbitrary acts condemned by public opinion as contrary to the code of warfare. Intense indignation among the Lorrainers and the Swiss forced René to retaliatory measures, and he ordered the execution of all the Burgundian prisoners. 120 bodies hung on the gibbets, each bearing an inscription to the effect that their death was the work of les téméraires. The rancor of the proceedings became terrible. No quarter was given in any engagements. Slaughter was the only thought on either side. Towards the end of December, one Thierry, a draper of Mirecourt, proved more successful than Bachy in reaching Nancy. His information that René's army would leave Basel on December 26th put heart into the besieged, and the bells rang out joyfully. Just at this epoch, there was an attempt at mediation between the combatants. The King of Portugal, nephew of Isabella, appeared at his cousin's camp and implored him to put an end to the carnage, and in the name of humanity to stop a war that was horrible to all the world. In spite of his own stress, Charles managed to give his kinsman a splendid reception, but he waved aside his petition and simply invited him to join him in his campaign. A week sufficed for the Swiss contingent to march from Basel to Nancy, across the plains of Alsace. Meantime, René had rallied about 4,000 men under Lorraine captains, and to this was added an Alsatian force which had joined him by way of St. Nicolas du Port. They were a rude, pitiless crowd, as they soon evinced by routing a few Burgundians out of the houses where they had hidden and massacring them publicly. A reconnaissance sent out by Charles was easily put to flight. On January 4th, Charles learned that fresh troops had reached St. Nicholas. He showed assurance, arrogance, and negligence. His belief in his star was fully restored. He actually did not take the trouble to try once more to ascertain the exact strength of the enemy. He had commissioned the Bishop of Forli to negotiate for him at Basel, and refused to credit the statement that the Swiss were throwing in their fortunes with René. He thought that the child, as he contemptuously termed his adversary, had simply gone right and left to hire mercenaries, and he rather ridiculed the idea of taking such canaille seriously, saying that it was a host unworthy of a gentleman. Still he resolved to meet and finish them once for all. It is a fact that the Swiss reinforcements were a different and far less efficient body than the volunteers of Granson and Morat had been. French gold, scattered freely, had done its work in exciting the cupidity of every man who could bear arms. There were some staunch leaders, like Waldemar of Zurich and Rudolf de Stein, but their kind was in the minority. Bern aided with money rather than with men, but she was not a generous ally, as she insisted on having hostages to ensure her repayment. A venal spirit was evident in every quarter. As the troops made their way over the Jura, their behavior showed that the late splendid booty had affected them. Plunder was their aim. When René reviewed these fresh arrivals from Basel, one of his attending officers was Oswald von Tierstein, late governor of Alsace. Disgraced by Sigismund, he had passed over to the Duke of Lorraine, who appointed him marshal. On that January 4th, a Saturday, Charles held a council meeting. The opinion of the wisest, already given on previous occasions, was urged again. Do not risk battle. René is poor. If there are no immediate engagements, his mercenaries will abandon him for lack of pay. Raise the siege and depart for Flanders and Luxembourg. The army can rest and be increased. Then, at the approach of spring, it will be easy to fall upon René, deprived of his troops. Charles was absolutely deaf to these arguments. He was determined on facing the issue at once. Leaving a small force to sustain the siege, he ordered the camp to be broken on the evening of the 4th, and a movement made towards St. Nicholas. He selected a ground favorable for the manipulation of a large body, and placed his artillery on a plateau situated between Jarville and Neuville. It was not a good position, being hedged in on the right and in front by woods which could conceal the movements of a foe without impeding them. Only one way of retreat was open, towards Metz, whose bishop was Charles's last ally. But to reach Metz, it was necessary to cross several small streams and deceptive marshes, half frozen as they were, besides the river Meurthe, a serious obstacle with the garrison of Nancy on the flank. In short, there was ample reason to dread surprise, while in case of defeat, a terrible catastrophe was more than possible. Curiously, the precise kind of difficulties which beset the field of Morat were repeated here, proof that Charles had not the qualities of a general who could learn by experience. The exact force at his disposal on this occasion has been variously estimated. Considering the ravages of the sanguinary skirmishes during the siege, and of the cold, it is probable that the actual combatants did not number more than 10,000 all told. And only half of these were of any value. 2,000 men under Galeotto, and 3,000 Burgundians commanded by Charles and his immediate lieutenants. The remainder were unreliable mercenaries, and the still more unreliable troops of Campobasso already pledged to the foe. Lamarche estimates René's force at 12,000, and adds, "The Duke of Burgundy was far behind, for on my conscience he had not 2,000 fighting men." The Allies adopted a plan of battle proposed by a Lorrainer, Vautrin-Huys. The first maneuver was to divert the foe and turn him towards the woods, and then to attack his center, which would at the same time be pressed at the front by the Lorraine forces, headed by René himself. The plan succeeded in every point. Surprised that they dared take the offensive, Charles was alert to the harsh cries of the bull of Uri and the cow of Unterwalden, which were heard across the woods. A sudden presentiment saddened him. Putting on his helmet, he accidentally knocked off the lion bearing the legend, Hoc est signum Dei. He replaced it and plunged into the melee. The onslaught was terrific. Galeotto's troops and the Duke's were the only ones to make sturdy resistance. The right wing of the army gave way under the fierce assault of the Swiss. The cry, Sauve qui pent, raised possibly by Campobasso's traitors, produced a terrible rout. 3/4 of the troops were in flight, while the Duke still fought on with superhuman ferocity. Galeotto, seeing that the day was lost, protected his own mercenaries as best he could, while Campobasso completed the treason that he had plotted with René, which had been partially accomplished 4 days previously, and calmly took up his position on the bridge of Bouxières on the Meurthe to make prisoners for the sake of ransom. Then the besieged made a sudden sortie which increased the disorder. The battle proper was of short duration, with little bloodshed, but the pursuit was sanguinary in the extreme, because the Burgundian army had left no loophole open for retreat. The Swiss pursued the fugitives hotly as far as Bouxières, and inflicted carnage right and left on the route. It was easy work. The morasses were traps, and the Burgundians, encumbered with their arms, found it impossible to free themselves when they once were entangled. They fell like flies before the fury of the mountaineers. The Lorrainers and Alsatians were more humane, or more mercenary, for they took prisoners instead of killing indiscriminately. Charles fought desperately to the very end. There is no doubt that he plunged into the thick of the fight and risked his life in a reckless manner, but there is absolute uncertainty as to how he met his death. It is generally accepted that the last person to see him alive was one Baptista Colonna, a page in the service of a Neapolitan captain. This lad, with an extra helmet swung over his shoulder, found himself close to the Duke. He saw him surrounded by troops, noticed his horse stumble, was sure that the rider fell. The next moment, Colonna's attention was diverted to himself. He was taken prisoner, and knew no more of the day's events. The figure of Charles of Burgundy disappears from the view of man. A curtain woven of vague rumor hides the closing scenes of his life. At 7 o'clock, the victorious Duke of Lorraine rode into the rescued city and re-entered his palace. At the gates was heaped up a ghastly memorial of the steadfastness of the burghers in their devotion to his cause. This was a pile of the bones of the foul animals they had consumed when other food was exhausted, rather than capitulate to their liege's foe. To ascertain the fate of that foe now became René's chief anxiety, and he dispatched messengers to Metz and elsewhere to find out where Charles had taken refuge. The reports were all negative. The first positive assurance that the Duke was dead came from young Baptista Colonna, whom Campobasso himself introduced into René's presence on Monday evening. The page told his tale, and declared that he could point out the precise place where he had seen the Duke of Burgundy fall. Accordingly, on Tuesday morning, January 7th, a party went forth from Nancy to the desolate battlefield, and were guided by Colonna to the edge of a pool, which he asserted confidently was the very spot where he had seen Charles. Circumstantial evidence went to give corroboration to his word, for the dozen or more bodies that lay strewn along the ground in the immediate vicinity of the pool were close friends and followers of the Duke, men who would, in all probability, have stayed faithfully by their master's person, a volunteer bodyguard, as long as they drew breath. These bodies were all stripped naked. Harpies had already gathered what plunder they could find, and no apparel or accoutrements were left to show the difference in rank between noble and page. But the faces were recognizable, and they were identified as well-known nobles of the Burgundian court. Separated from this group by a little space, at the very edge of the pool, was another naked body in still more doleful plight. The face was disfigured beyond all semblance of what it might have been in life. One cheek was bitten by wolves. One was embedded in the frozen slime. Yet there was evidence on the poor forsaken remains that convinced the searchers that this was indeed the mortal part of the great Duke. 2 wounds from a pick and a blow above the ear, inflicted by one named Humbert, showed how death had been caused. The missing teeth corresponded to those lost by Charles. There was a scar just where he had received his wound at Montlhéry. The fingernails were long like his, a wound on the shoulder, a fistula on the groin, and an ingrowing nail were additional marks of identification. 6 definite proofs in all. Among those who gazed at this wretched sight on that January morning were men intimately acquainted with the Duke's person. There were his physician, a Portuguese named Mathieu, and his valets, besides Olivier de la Marche, and Denis, his chaplain, who were taken thither, and there was no doubt that he was dead. It has not yet been decided where he will be buried, and to know it better, it, the body, has been bathed in warm water and good wine and cleansed. In that state it was recognizable by all who had previously seen and known him. The page who had given the information was taken to the king. Had it not been for him, it would never have been known what had become of him, considering the state and the place where he was found. Before the body could be freed from the ice in which it was embedded, implements had to be brought from Nancy. 4 Lorraine nobles hastened to the spot when they heard the tidings, to show honor to the man who had been their accepted lord for a brief period, and they acted as escort as the burden was carried into the town and placed in a suitable chamber in the home of one George Marquier. There seems to have been no insult offered to the fallen man, no lack of deference in the proceedings. The very spot where the bier rested for a moment was marked with a little black cross. As the corpse was bathed, 3 wounds became evident: a deep cut from a halberd in the head, spear thrusts through the thighs and abdomen, proofs of the closeness of the last struggle. When all the dignity possible had been given to the miserable human fragment, and the chamber hung with conventional mourning, René came thither clad in black garments. Kneeling by the bier, he said, "Would to God, fair cousin, that your misfortunes and mine had not reduced you to the condition in which I see you." For 5 days the body lay in state before the high altar of the church of St. George, and the obsequies that followed were attended by René and his nobles, and the coffin was honorably placed among the ducal dead. Yet doubt of the man's existence was not buried with the bones to which his name was given. When the Swiss turned their way homeward, their farewell words to René were, "If the Duke of Burgundy has escaped and should reopen war, tell us." "If he has assured his safety," René answered, "we will fight again when summer comes." There was no delay, however, in the division of the spoils. the Burgundian treasure was distributed among René's allies, and the ignorant soldiers received articles worth many times their pay, which they, in many cases, disposed of for an infinitesimal part of their value. As late as January 28th, Margaret of York and Mary of Burgundy wrote to Louis XI from Ghent. We are still hoping that Monseigneur is alive in the hands of his enemies. Other rumors continued to be current, not only for weeks but for years. In 1482, it was gravely recounted that the vanished Duke had retired to Bruskel in Swabia, where he led an austere life. Genus vitae horridum atque asperum. Bets were made, too, on the chances of his return. Louis XI was a very pleasant person when news was brought him that he liked to hear. Comines and Boussage together had told him about the defeat of Morat, and had each received 200 silver marks. It was a Seigneur de Lude who had the good luck to bring him letters from Craon recounting the Battle of Nancy. It was really difficult for the king to keep his countenance, so surprised was he with joy. His letter to Craon was written on January 9th and ran as follows. Monsieur the Count, my friend, I have received your letter and heard the good news that you impart to me, for which I thank you as much as I can. Now is the time to use all your 5 natural senses to deliver the duchy and county of Burgundy into my hands. If the Duke be dead, do you and the governor of Champagne take your troops and put yourselves within the land, and, if you love me, keep as good order among your men as if you were in Paris, and prove that I mean to treat them, the Burgundians, better than any one in my realm. The 5 natural senses of the king's lieutenant were employed most loyally to his master's service. The Duchy of Burgundy returned to the French crown. Before Easter, the estates were convened by Louis XI, and there was no longer any duke in Burgundy to be an over-powerful peer in France. With the exception of Guelders, the lands acquired by Charles fell away, but the remainder, as inherited by him, passed under the rule of his daughter Mary, who carried her heritage into the House of Austria, through which it passed finally to the King of Spain. On that fatal 5th of January, Charles of Burgundy had only just passed middle life. He was 44 years, 1 month, and 26 days old, an age when a man has the right to look forward to new achievements. Every circumstance of the dreary and premature death was in glaring contrast to his prospects at his birth in 1433, in insolent contradiction to his own estimation of the obligations assumed by fate in his behalf. In certain details of the catastrophe there are, of course, accidents. No one could have predicted that the Duke, whose chief title was a synonym for magnificence, that this cherished heir to his house, who had been bathed in all the luxury known to his epoch, should have thus lain in death many hours long, unattended and uncared for, naked and frozen on a bed of congealed mud, with a winter sky as canopy. The actual adversity as it overwhelmed him was too appalling for any foresight. But the great dream of the man's life that vanished with his vitality owed its annihilation to no mere chance of warfare. Had it not been rudely ended by the Battle of Nancy, other means of destruction, inevitable and sure, would have appeared. The projected erection of a solidified kingdom stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland and possibly to the Mediterranean, one that could hold the balance of power between France and Germany, contained elements of disintegration, latent at its foundation. It is clear, from a consideration of the Duke of Burgundy and his position in the Europe of his time, that the materials which he expected to mold into a realm were a collection of sentient units. Each separate one was instinct with individual life, individual desires, conscious of its own minute past, capable of directing its own contracted future. That the hereditary title of overlord to each political unity had lodged, upon a head already dignified by a plurality of similar titles, was a mere chance, and viewed by the burghers in a wholly different light from that in which this same overlord regarded it. The fishers in Holland, the manufacturers in Brabant, the merchants in Flanders, the vintners in Burgundy, cared nothing for being the wings of an imperial idea. They wanted safe fishing grounds, unmolested highways of commerce, vineyards free from the tramp of armies. And with their desires fixed on these as needful, their attitude towards the political centralization planned by their common ruler often betrayed both ignorance and inconsistency. At various epochs, some degree of imperialism for the Netherland group had been quite to popular taste. In Holland, Zeeland, and Hainaut, it had been conceded that Jacqueline of Bavaria was less efficient to maintain desirable conditions than her cousin of Burgundy, and the exchange of sovereigns had been effected in spite of the manifest injustice involved in the transaction. But while there was willingness to accept any advantages that might accrue to a people from the reputation of a local overlord, it was never forgotten for an instant that his relation to his subjects was at their own court and strictly limited by conditions that had long existed within each petty territory. While Charles seemed to be on the straight road towards his goal, the people within each body politic of his inherited states were profoundly preoccupied with their own local concerns, and only alive to his schemes when they feared demands upon their internal revenues for external purposes. It does not seem probable, however, that the abstract question of the projected kingdom was ever taken very seriously among those to be directly affected by the proposed change. The bars interposed by his own subjects in the Duke's progress towards royalty were obstructions to his successive steps rather than to his theory. Indeed, strenuous opposition to details was allied to a vague and passive acceptance of the whole. Moreover, when the idea was phrased, it was distinctly as a revival, not as a novelty. The previous existence of a kingdom of Burgundy was undoubtedly a potent factor in the degree of progress made by Charles towards conjuring into new life a reincarnation of that ancient realm. Yet it was a factor clothed with a shadow rather than with the substance of truth. Geographically, there was very little in common between the dominion projected more or less definitely in 1473, and any one of the kingdoms of Burgundy as they had successively existed. That of Charles corresponded very nearly to the ancient kingdom of Lorraine. Franche-Comté was the only ground common to the territories actually held by the Duke and to the latest kingdom of Burgundy. His possessions in Picardy and Alsace lay wholly beyond the limits of either Burgundy or Lorraine. But the old name survived in his ducal title, and it was that name that lent a semblance of reality to this 15th century dream of a middle kingdom as outlined in the Duke's mind more or less definitely, or as bounded by his ambition. In retrospect, it is clear that more was requisite for the realization of the vision of the wished-for nation than imperial investiture of a crowned monarch with sovereignty over a group of lands. A modern writer has pointed out how infinitely subtle is the vital principle of a nation, one not even to be created by common interests. A Zollverein is no patria. An element of sentiment is needful, and an element of growth. The nation, like the individual, is the result of what has gone before. An heroic past, great men, glory that can command respect at home and abroad, that is the capital on which is based a national idea. To have wrought in common, to wish to accomplish more in the future, are essential conditions to be a people. The existence of a nation is a plebiscite of every day, just as the existence of the individual is a perpetual affirmation of life. Now it is evident, in summing up the salient features of this failure, that a vital principle was not germinating in the inchoate mass. Charles himself never attained the rank of a national hero. More than that, with all his individual states, he never had any nation, great or small, at his back. Personally, he was a man without a country. His father, Philip, was French, pure and simple, quite as French as his grandfather, Philip the Hardy, the first Duke of Burgundy, out of the house of Valois, even though Philip the Good had extended his sway to many non-French speaking peoples, and was able to use the Flemish speech if it suited his whim. But that was a condescension, and as something extraneous. The chief of French peers remained his proudest title, his ability to influence French affairs, the task he liked best. His son was quite different in his attitude towards France. He minimized his degree of French blood royal. More than once he boasted of his kinship with Portuguese, with English stock. He had certain characteristics of an immigrant, who has abandoned family traditions and is proudly confident that his bequest to posterity is to outshine what he has inherited. Charles was not exactly a stupid man, but he certainly was dazzled by his early surroundings into an overestimate of himself, into a conceit that was a tremendous stumbling block in his path. He had not the kind of intelligence that would have enabled him to take at their worth the rhetorical phrases of adulation heaped upon him on festal occasions. Yet this same conceit, this very self-confidence, gave him a high conception of his duties. At his accession, he showed a sense of his responsibilities, a definite theory of conduct which he fully intended to act upon. His very belief in his own powers gave him an intrinsic honesty of purpose. He was convinced that he could maintain law, order, justice in his domain, and he fully intended to do so in a paternal way, but he left out of consideration the rights of the people, rights older than his dynasty. In his military career, too, at the outset, he evinced the strongest bent towards preserving the best conditions possible amid the brutalities of warfare. He curbed the soldiers' passions, he protected women, and was as relentless towards miscreants in his ranks as towards his foe. In civil matters, he exerted himself to secure impartial equity for all alike. When he gave a promise, he fully intended to make his words good. It was only in the face of repeated deceptions of the cleverer and more unscrupulous Louis XI that Charles changed for the worse. Exasperated by the knowledge that the king's solemn pledges were given repeatedly with no intention of fulfillment, he attempted to adopt a similar policy, and was singularly infelicitous in his imitation. His political methods degenerated into mere barefaced lying, softened by no graces, illumined by no clever intuition of where to draw the line. From 1472 on, the Duke's word was worth no more than the King's, and words were assuredly at a discount just then. A perusal of the international correspondence of the period leaves the reader marveling why time was wasted in covering paper with flimsy, insincere phrases, mendacious signposts, which gave no true indication of the road to be traveled. There are, however, differences in the art of dissimulation, and Charles never attained a mastery of the science. The adjective which has attached itself to his name in English is an inaccurate rendering of le téméraire, which belongs to him in French. There were other terms, too, applied to Charles at different periods of his career. He was Charles the Hardy in his early youth, Charles the Terrible in those last months when he tried to fortify himself with wine, unsuited to his constitution, but at all times he might have been called Charles the Self-Absorbed, Charles the Solitary. There have been many men more passionate, more uncontrolled than Charles of Burgundy, whose personal magnetism yet enabled them to win friends and to keep them, as the Duke was powerless to do. The failure to command personal devotion, unquestioning loyalty, was one of his chief personal misfortunes. Philip, magnificent, lavish, debonair, found many lenient apologists for his crimes, while his son received criticism for his faults, even from the faithful among his servitors. How a reflection of his bearing glows out from the mirror turned casually upon him by Comines' skilful hand! Take the glimpse of Louis XI as he lures on St. Paul's messenger to imitate Charles. The Sire de Creville, inspired by the royal interest in his narration about an incident at the court of Burgundy, puffs out his cheeks, stamps his feet in a dictatorial manner, and swears by St. George as he quotes the Duke's words. Behind a screen are hidden Comines, and a Burgundian envoy aghast at hearing his liege lord so mocked. It is a time when St. Paul is trying to ride 3 horses at once, and the French king takes this method to have Charles informed of his duplicity. "Speak louder," he says. "I grow a little deaf." And the flattered envoy repeats his dramatic performance in a way to engrave it on the memory of the Duke's retainer. In thus touching on the traits of his former master, Comines does not show malice or even a dislike for the Duke. He is much more severe about Louis, only he found the latter easier to serve. In his family life, too, Charles does not seem to have found any companionship that affected his life. He is lauded as a faithful husband to Isabella of Bourbon, but her death seemed to make little difference. Neither she nor Margaret of York had the actual significance enjoyed by Isabella of Portugal as consort to Philip the Good with his notoriously roving fancy. Thus at home, as well as abroad, the last Duke of Burgundy tried to stand alone. Perhaps his chief happiness in life was that he never knew how insufficient for his desired task he was, and how the new art of printing, the birth of Erasmus of Rotterdam, were the really great events of his brief decade of sovereignty. It was his good fortune that he never knew that no splendid achievement gave significance to his device. I have undertaken it. Je l'ai emprunt. End of chapter 21. End of Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy, by Ruth Putnam.